She stepped off the train with a letter promising marriage and was handcuffed right there on the platform in front of the whole town. No one stepped forward to defend her. No one dared, because the man who signed the letter, the man who was supposed to pick her up, stood motionless in the distance, his face as cold as stone. This is the story of a woman erased from the system, rejected by society, and betrayed by fate itself, yet still chooses to rise again. If you enjoy stories about the true power of humanity, like and comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far my story has come. And don't go anywhere because the best part is yet to come. The train slowed before Clara Wynne could compose herself. She had been rehearsing what she would say since Cheyenne. Simple things, practical things. The kind of sentences a woman says when she arrives at a stranger's door and needs to make clear she is not a burden. I can cook. I can work. I learn quickly. She'd said them quietly to herself in the rattling dark of the passenger car, the words worn smooth from repetition until they barely felt like words at all, just the sound of her own breath organized into something resembling confidence. But then the whistle blew, the brakes groaned, and the train lurched to its final stop, and everything she'd rehearsed dissolved. Red Hollow, Wyoming. Population 400 and something. End of the line. She gathered her bag, one bag, canvas, the strap repaired twice with different thread so it showed, and stood in the aisle while other passengers pushed past her without apology. A man in a good coat knocked her shoulder and didn't turn around. A woman with 2 children pressed close to the window to avoid touching her. Clara kept her eyes down and waited until the car emptied, then made her way to the door alone. The platform was dust and noise and the smell of coal smoke and cattle and something underneath both of those things, some drier, older smell that she couldn't name but recognized from the letters. Thomas Reed had written about the valley in his 3rd letter. The air here is different from the city, he'd said. Cleaner, though that probably sounds like something a man says when he's trying to sell a woman on a hard life. She had appreciated that, the admission, the small honesty of it. She had read that letter 4 times. She stepped off the train and stood on the platform and looked for him. There were men waiting, a cluster of them near the freight car, unloading barrels. 2 more at the far end of the platform, talking close and low. A station agent behind his window, watching her with the particular flatness of a man who has seen too many things arrive on trains and learned not to be surprised by any of them. No Thomas Reed. No one holding a sign. No one scanning the platform with the uncertain hopefulness of a man who doesn't quite know what his bride looks like because the photograph she sent was 4 years old and taken in better circumstances. She waited. The train finished unloading. The engine idled and then groaned back to life, pulling out toward the next town, and the noise of it covered everything for a moment. The platform vibrating under her feet, the smoke thickening, the world reduced to that enormous mechanical leaving. And then it was gone, and Red Hollow was quiet, and Clara was standing alone on a platform in a town where nobody knew her name except to have read it in a letter. And the men near the freight car had stopped working to look at her, and the station agent still hadn't moved. She picked up her bag and walked to the window. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm looking for Thomas Reed. He was supposed to meet me here." The agent looked at her for a moment before answering. He had the face of a man who had opinions about things he didn't say out loud. "Reed Ranch," he said finally. "That's about 6 miles out. Reed doesn't come to town much." "He was supposed to meet me today." "Was he?" It wasn't a question. She held his gaze. "I'm Clara Wynne. I've come from Ohio. We've been corresponding for 7 months. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, more like recognition. The particular way a man's face changes when a rumor he's heard gets a face attached to it. "Ah," he said. "The bride." The way he said it, the bride. She felt it like a small, cold stone placed in her chest. "Is there a livery where I could arrange transport?" "Gideon's," he said, and pointed up the main street without looking at her. "Past the dry goods." She thanked him and walked off the platform and into Red Hollow's main street. It was the kind of town that looked better from a distance. Up close, the storefronts were weathered past what paint could fix, and the boardwalk had gaps where boards had rotted and not been replaced. There were people on the street, women in aprons, men moving between buildings, a boy chasing something in the alley between the hardware and the milliner. And they all had the same quality to them. A stillness when she passed, a silence that opened up around her like water around a stone dropped into it. She walked straight. She kept her chin level. She'd had practice at this, walking through places that didn't want her, keeping her face neutral while her chest went tight. She'd had more practice than most women her age, which was not a thing she was proud of. The livery smelled of horses and old straw and manure and some hay somewhere that was beginning to turn. The man inside, Gideon himself presumably, thick-armed and taciturn in the way of men who spend most of their working hours with animals rather than people, looked at her and then at her bag and then back at her face. "I need to get to the Reed Ranch," she said. "I can pay." "How much you got?" She told him. He named a price that was slightly higher, and she paid it without arguing because she didn't have time to argue, and because she'd learned that negotiating over small amounts of money in front of strangers who've already decided your worth is rarely worth the cost. He hitched a horse to a small wagon without speaking. She sat up on the bench beside him, and they pulled out of the livery into the afternoon sun, and she watched Red Hollow slide away behind them and then disappear as they turned south toward the valley. The land opened up past the town limits, wide and dry and golden brown in the late summer heat, the grass gone brittle, the road a pale line between hills that rolled on forever. There were cattle in the distance, dark dots against the pale earth, hawks circling. The sky was enormous, the kind of sky that made a person feel small in a way that wasn't entirely unpleasant, because at least in front of something that vast, your problems took their proper proportion. Clara held her bag on her lap and watched the land and thought about the letter. Not the third letter, which she'd memorized. The first one. The one that had come to the boarding house in Columbus in February, addressed to any eligible woman of honest character and steady temperament, forwarded through the correspondence bureau. She had not been the first woman at the boarding house to read it. 3 others had passed it over. Too far, too remote, too uncertain. Clara had read it last, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp already lit because the light outside was failing, and she had read it twice and then folded it carefully and gone to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and thought about what she had to weigh it against. What she had to weigh it against was not much. A job at the laundry that paid enough to eat on and not enough to save. A room at the boarding house with a window that faced a wall. A history she couldn't outrun in Columbus because Columbus was not large enough to get lost in. Not really. Not for a woman whose name had appeared in the court ledger twice in 3 years, even if neither entry was what the ledger made it look like. She had written back. She had not told him about the court ledger. This was the thing she carried, not in her bag, but underneath everything else, in the place where she kept the things she hadn't said yet and didn't know how to say. She had been careful in her letters, honest about her situation, her poverty, her lack of family, her willingness to work. She had been careful not to lie about anything she said. She had simply not said everything. There was a difference. She had told herself the difference was enough. 6 miles takes longer than it sounds in a wagon on a rutted road in July heat. By the time the fence posts of the Reed Ranch appeared, her back ached and her mouth was dry, and the sun was dropping toward the western ridge in a way that turned everything bronze and long-shadowed. The main gate was a simple affair. 2 posts and a crosspiece with the ranch name burned into the wood, the letters slightly uneven, like a man who'd done it himself and didn't have a natural gift for lettering but did it anyway. She noticed this. It seemed like the kind of detail that told you something. Gideon pulled through the gate without stopping and continued up the drive to the main house, which was a 2-story structure of weathered timber, solid-looking if not beautiful, with a porch that wrapped around 2 sides and a barn off to the left that was larger than the house. There were chickens in the yard, which scattered as the wagon approached. A dog barked once from somewhere and then went quiet. No one came out. Gideon set the brake and didn't offer to help her down. She climbed down herself, her legs stiff, her bag over her shoulder, and she stood in the yard and looked at the house and waited. The door opened, and the first person who came out was not Thomas Reed. It was a child, a girl, maybe 7 or 8, in a dress that had been washed so many times the original color was only a memory. Her feet were bare, dusty to the ankle, and her hair was in braids that had survived the morning but not the afternoon. She stood on the porch and looked at Clara with the frank, unself-conscious stare of a child who hadn't yet learned to pretend she wasn't curious. "Are you the lady from the letter?" she asked. "I am," Clara said. "My name is Clara. What's yours?" "Molly." A beat. My papa said you were coming today. He forgot. Clara kept her expression steady. That happens. He's in the north pasture. He'll be back before supper. Molly came down the porch steps and stopped a few feet away, looking up at her. You're prettier than I thought. Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Gideon clicked at his horse and turned the wagon around and headed back up the drive without ceremony, and then it was just Clara and Molly and the sound of chickens and the cooling evening air. Can I carry something? Molly asked, looking at the bag. I've got it, but thank you. Mama used to say thank you like that, like it was real. Clara looked at her. The girl wasn't sad when she said it, just observational, recording something. I'm sorry about your mother, Clara said. She's been gone 2 years. Molly seemed to consider this. Papa doesn't talk about her. He talks about the ranch, and the cattle prices, and the fence along the eastern border that needs fixing. She paused. He talks about the fence a lot. Despite everything, Clara almost smiled. Where should I put my things? I'll show you. Papa had me clean the spare room. I put flowers in it, but they might be wilted now. She followed Molly into the house. Muck. The spare room was small, with a window that faced east, and a bed with a quilt that had seen hard use but was clean. And Molly's flowers, some kind of dried wildflower in a tin cup on the sill, were in fact wilted, but the gesture of them was so earnest that Clara set her bag down and looked at them for a moment before anything else. They're fine, she said. Thank you, Molly. You can throw them out if you want. I'll keep them a little longer. She heard him before she saw him. Boots on the porch, the particular heavy-footed sound of a tired man who's been on his feet since before dawn, the door opening with the ease of a man who's lived in a place long enough that his hands know where everything is in the dark. She heard him stop. She came out of the spare room and stood at the end of the hall. Thomas Reed was not what she had imagined. The photograph he'd sent, stiff, formal, taken by someone who'd told him not to smile, had given her a man of middle age with a hard face and careful eyes. The man standing in his own doorway looking at her was that, and also more worn than the photograph suggested. His hair was darker, his jaw unshaved, his shirt carrying the dust of a working day. He was not an ugly man. He was a man who had stopped paying attention to whether he was or wasn't. They looked at each other across the length of the hallway for a moment that went a beat too long. Miss Wynne, he said finally. Mr. Reed. She moved toward him and stopped a few feet short. I understand there was some confusion about the time. I lost track. He didn't apologize exactly, but something in his face did. Some small tightening, a look directed briefly at the floor. I should have been at the station. It was fine. I found my way. The station agent was not especially warm, but I've managed in colder rooms. She said it evenly, not as a complaint. Your daughter found me. She showed me to the room. He looked at Molly, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with the expression of a child who knows she's done something right and is waiting for someone to say so. He didn't say so, but his eyes softened for just a second before he looked back at Clara. You'd like supper, he said. After traveling. I'd like to wash first, if there's water. Pumps around the side. There's a basin in the kitchen. Thank you. She moved past him toward the kitchen. He stepped aside. Neither of them touched. Supper was beans and salt pork and cornbread that Molly had clearly made with some adult assistance. The edges were uneven, the texture varied, but it was warm and filling, and Clara ate without comment or complaint, which seemed to be the right choice because Thomas watched her from across the table with the cautious attention of a man taking measure. You're from Ohio, he said. Not a question. He'd written it down somewhere. Columbus. What did you do there? Laundry work. Before that, I was a housekeeper for a family on the north side. Before that, I worked in a dry goods store. No family left? No. She met his eyes. I mentioned that in my letters. You did. I remembered when I read it. I sometimes forget what I've read and what I've just thought about enough to seem like I've read. He said this without apparent embarrassment, as a simple fact about himself. She found it unexpectedly disarming. I don't have a mother or a father. There was a brother. He died in 81. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. Molly ate her beans and watched them both with open attention. She was not pretending not to listen. Children that age rarely bothered. I want to be clear about what I'm offering, Thomas said, in the tone of a man who has prepared a statement. I wrote the correspondence bureau because Molly needs someone. He paused, changed course. Because the ranch needs managing, the domestic side of it. There's too much for one person to keep up with the way I've been doing it. Molly's been trying to help and she's able, but she's a child and she shouldn't have to. Another pause. I want to be clear that this is a practical arrangement, Clara said. He looked at her. I know what I agreed to, she said. I read your letters carefully. You were honest about your situation, and I was honest about mine. She held his gaze. This was the moment where she almost said the rest. The part about the court ledger, about Columbus, about the things she'd been not saying in every letter. I'm not expecting more than what was agreed. A home, work, fair treatment. You'll have all three, he said. Flat, direct, not a promise dressed up as more than it was. She appreciated that too. Then we understand each other. Molly looked from one of them to the other. Does this mean you're staying? She asked Clara. Clara looked at the child, at the badly made cornbread and the wilted flowers she'd put in the spare room and the braids coming undone at the ends. For now, she said. Yes. The first week was the hardest, which was usually true. She was up before Molly, before Thomas, coaxing the stove to life in a kitchen she didn't know yet, learning where the tin cups hung, which drawer stuck, how much the oven ran hot, and at what point the cornbread needed turning. She made mistakes. She burned the edge of a pan of biscuits on the third morning and stood looking at it with the particular flat feeling of a person who's had too many things go wrong and has learned not to cry over a pan of biscuits. But still, Thomas appeared in his kitchen doorway, saw the pan, said nothing, poured himself coffee and went out to the barn. That was its own kind of mercy. The work was not gentle. The Reed Ranch kept cattle, 112 head, as Thomas told her on the second day with the specificity of a man for whom those numbers were a kind of prayer. And the domestic side of supporting that operation was not small. There was the house to clean and maintain, the cooking for 3 people and sometimes a hired hand named Bart, who came in twice a week, the mending and washing, and the kitchen garden that had been neglected since before Elizabeth Reed died and needed work before anything useful could come out of it. She worked. That was what she knew how to do. Move through the day with your hands occupied. Don't stop long enough to think too hard about anything. Find the satisfaction in the concrete, the clean dish, the mended seam, the weeded row. Thomas left her alone to do it, which was both good and strange. He was not a man who lingered. He was in the barn before light, out on the range most of the day, back for supper, brief and quiet at the table, and then gone again to do the kind of evening accounting that running a ranch required. He spoke when spoken to. He answered questions directly. He never once suggested she was doing something wrong, which she suspected was because he was watching too carefully to catch her at it. And she was careful not to give him reason. Molly was different. Molly was everywhere. She appeared in the kitchen while Clara cooked and asked questions about everything. Where she'd come from, what Columbus looked like, whether there were really buildings 6 stories tall, whether she'd ever seen the ocean, what she thought of the ranch, what she thought of the horses, whether she could braid hair because Molly's own braids were always coming out and she couldn't quite reach the back properly. Clara answered the questions she could and deflected the ones she couldn't. And on the 4th morning, she sat Molly down on a stool in the kitchen and did her hair properly, tight and even, with the small care of someone who'd once had someone do the same for her. And Molly sat very still during the whole thing, which Clara suspected was not her natural state. You're good at it, Molly said when Clara finished. I had practice. On who? Myself, mostly. You learn fast when there's no one else to do it. Molly was quiet for a moment, which was unusual for her. Is that why you came here? Because there was no one? Clara was quiet too, for the space of a breath. Partly, she said. Papa came here because of Mama, Molly said. She wanted the ranch. He got it for her. She paused. She didn't get to keep it very long. Clara set down the comb. What happened to her? Your mother? She fell, Molly said. From the loft in the barn. Papa says. And then, with the particular flatness of a child repeating something they've turned over many times. But the door to the loft was always latched from the inside. She used to latch it herself because she said a fall from there would be the end of her. A beat. Papa doesn't know I know that. Clara looked at the back of the girl's head, the braid she'd just done, neat and precise. "Molly," she said carefully, "have you told anyone else what you just told me?" "No." "All right." She didn't say more, but something in her chest had shifted, gone careful and watchful in a way she recognized. The same feeling she'd had in Columbus when she'd first understood that the charge against her was not a mistake, when she'd first understood that someone had placed it there deliberately. Thomas Reed did not trust her. He was not unkind about it. It wasn't in him to be casually cruel, but she could feel it the way you can feel weather changing. He watched her work with a proprietary attention. He kept the ranch ledgers locked. When Bart came for his twice-weekly days, Thomas was always nearby, always in earshot, which might have been coincidence and probably wasn't. She understood it. She would have done the same in his position. A woman he'd never met, recommended by a bureau he'd used because there was no other option. In his house with his daughter and 7 years of his work. He had no reason to trust her and plenty of reason to remain careful. She gave him no reason to distrust her either, which was its own kind of argument, made in small daily ways rather than words. On the 11th day, he stopped in the kitchen doorway while she was doing the breakfast washing and said, without preamble, "You don't complain." She looked at him over her shoulder. "There's nothing to complain about." "There's plenty. This is hard work and it's not your land." I agreed to it. He looked at her for a moment. "Most people who agree to something hard don't stay agreeable once they're in the middle of it." "Most people haven't had worse," she said, and turned back to the washing. He left without answering. But the next morning, the ranch ledger was sitting on the kitchen table. Open, not locked. A column of numbers she hadn't been asked to look at. She didn't touch it. But she looked at it long enough to see that the accounts were in poor shape, that there were creditor names she didn't recognize, that some of the entries in the past year were marked with question marks in the margin. She said nothing. She set breakfast out and called Molly and waited. It was on the 14th day that she found the journal. She'd been sent to the barn loft to move some stored goods. Thomas needed the west wall cleared to hang the new tack he'd bought in town, and the loft was where years of unsorted household things had accumulated. Boxes of papers, crates of old tools, a broken chair, a trunk of winter clothes that hadn't been opened since before Elizabeth Reed's death. Clara worked methodically, moving things to the far wall, making space. The loft was hot in the afternoon, close and dry, the smell of old wood and dust and mouse, the light coming in narrow between the boards. She moved a crate of household papers, and it was heavier than expected, and when she set it down, it shifted and something slid out from under it. A leather journal. Small, worn at the corners, with a brass clasp that had been bent and then bent back. Her name. Not Clara's name. Elizabeth was stamped inside the front cover in a careful hand. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. She should not have opened it. She opened it. Elizabeth Reed had not been a woman who wrote about her feelings. The journal was not a diary in the conventional sense. It was a record. Pages of names and dates and amounts of money and parcels of land described in the careful terms of someone who had learned to read legal documents. Names Clara didn't recognize. Figures that looked like bribes. A series of entries tracking what appeared to be a pattern of land claim challenges, all tied to a single name. Harmon and Associates, Red Hollow and Territorial Counties. She read for 20 minutes without moving. Elizabeth had been following a thread. Starting with a dispute over a neighboring parcel, the Halverson land, she called it, bought by Harmon Interests through a sheriff's sale that Elizabeth believed was fraudulent, and pulling it further, deeper, through layers of county records and correspondence with a lawyer in Cheyenne who never wrote back, and a judge in Laramie who she noted had connections to H that should preclude him from any case in this valley. The entries grew shorter and more urgent toward the end, less careful. The handwriting changed, tightened, became the writing of someone working fast. The last entry was dated 3 weeks before Elizabeth Reed died. I have found the documents. They are in T's name, but the signatures are not his. I know his signature and these are close, but not right. They mean to take the ranch through legal means when the forgery holds. If it holds. I am going to the county recorder tomorrow to file the challenge. I have not told Thomas because he will try to stop me from going alone, and I cannot wait. The latch on the loft door is stuck again. I must remember to fix it. Clara sat in the hot, close air of the loft with the journal in her hands and the dust settling around her and the sound of the cattle somewhere below in the yard. And she thought about what she was holding and what it meant, and she thought about Molly's voice. The door to the loft was always latched from the inside. And she thought about her own conviction in Columbus and the name of the man who'd pressed the charge. And she looked again at the name in the journal, Harmon and Associates. She thought about this correspondence bureau, the one that had connected her to Thomas Reed, the one based out of Cheyenne, which was the same city Elizabeth had written to a lawyer who never replied. She was still sitting there, not moving, when she heard the barn door open below. "Miss Wynne," Thomas's voice. Not unfriendly, just locating her. "Supper's an hour off. You about done up there?" She looked at the journal. She looked at the latch on the door at the top of the loft stairs, which was closed and smooth and showed no sign of being stuck. "Almost," she said. Her voice came out level. "Give me a few more minutes." She heard him move off toward the house. She looked at the journal again. Every instinct she had, the particular instincts of a woman who'd been on the wrong side of things she hadn't done, who knew what it felt like when a story was being shaped around you by people with reasons of their own, said, "Don't leave this where it was. Don't put it back in the crate and act as though it never happened." She pulled the hem of her dress free from her waistband and wrapped the journal in it, tucked it under her arm, and climbed down from the loft. She didn't tell Thomas that evening. She sat across from him at supper and watched him talk to Molly about the cattle count and the fence along the eastern border, and she watched him eat the meal she'd made and say it was good in the brief way he said most things. And she looked at his hands on the table, a working man's hands, scarred across the knuckles, the kind of hands that are what they are and don't apologize for it. And she thought about Elizabeth's handwriting. The signatures are not his. I know his signature. He didn't know. Whatever was happening to his ranch, he didn't know it yet. That was the other thing she was sure of. She had been reading Thomas Reed carefully for 2 weeks, the way she'd learned to read people. Not for what they said, but for what they couldn't stop their faces from doing. And what she saw in him was a man carrying grief and exhaustion and the stubborn, unseen determination of someone who believes that if he just works hard enough, the world will hold together. Not the composure of a man running a conspiracy. The composure of a man who is trying not to drown. She washed the supper dishes alone and dried them alone and went to her room and took the journal from under her mattress where she'd put it and sat on the edge of her bed and read it again, slower this time, making note of every name. Harmon and Associates. She'd heard that name before she came to Wyoming. She hadn't known it then. She knew it now, sitting in the spare room of the Reed Ranch with the June night coming in through the east window, the smell of dry grass and cooling earth, the sound of Molly, long since asleep in the room above. She'd heard it in a courtroom, in the mouth of the prosecutor who'd argued the case against her. A man connected to a law firm, Harmon and Associates, that represented the property owner whose goods she'd supposedly stolen. Goods she'd never seen, a crime she'd never committed, in a city she'd only been in for 3 weeks, working a job she'd only just started. She sat with that for a long time. The moon came up and moved across the window, and she was still sitting there, the journal on her knee, the candle burning down, thinking about all the ways a system can reach out and press a person into a shape that serves it, and all the ways that pressure leaves marks, and all the things she hadn't said in her letters to Thomas Reed, and what she was going to do now. She didn't know yet, but she knew she wasn't going to do nothing. She put the journal back under the mattress and blew out the candle and lay down on Elizabeth Reed's good plain quilt in the dark. And outside the window, the stars were the kind of thick and close you never saw in Columbus. And the ranch settled around her with the particular sounds of a place that is living even when people aren't watching it. And Clara Wynne lay there in the dark and thought, I am going to have to tell him. Not tonight. She didn't have enough yet. She needed to read the journal twice more, carefully, to map what Elizabeth had mapped, to understand what she'd found, and where it led before she could put it in front of a man who was going to need to trust her in order to hear it. A man who didn't trust her yet. She needed time. She needed to be careful. She heard it then. The creak of a floorboard in the hallway, slow and deliberate. Not Molly. She'd learned Molly's footsteps, the quick light pattern of a child who moves on impulse. This was measured, adult. And then silence. And then the sound of someone trying the latch on her door. It didn't open. She'd latched it before she lay down. Old habit from old necessity. A long silence from the hallway. and then the footsteps moving away, careful and slow, back toward the front of the house. She lay in the dark with her eyes open and her hand flat on the mattress over the place where the journal was. The ranch had stopped sounding like a living place. Everything was still, like something was listening. She didn't sleep for a long time. She was up before the stove was warm. The sky outside the east window was still the flat gray of pre-dawn when Clara swung her legs off the bed and sat there for a moment, listening to the house. Nothing. The floorboard in the hall was quiet. The barn was quiet. Even the chickens hadn't started yet. Whatever had tried her door in the night, whoever, was gone now, or sleeping, or pretending to. She reached under the mattress and pulled the journal out and looked at it in the gray light. Then she got up, went to her bag, and found the place at the bottom where the canvas lining had separated slightly from the frame, an old split she'd never repaired, and she worked the journal into that space and pressed the lining back against it. Not invisible, but not obvious either, not to someone searching quickly. She dressed and went to start the stove. Thomas came in from the barn at his usual time, which was just past first light, his boots caked from the yard, his face carrying the particular sealed quality of a man who'd been alone with his thoughts for 2 hours already. He poured his coffee and stood at the window and drank it, looking at the range, the way he did every morning, like the land was a ledger he was checking. Clara set out the biscuits, not burned this time, and the salt butter and the remainder of last night's beans heated up, and she moved around the kitchen with the practiced efficiency she'd spent 3 weeks building. And she did not look at him too directly or too long because she had a thing she needed to do, and she needed him not to notice she was thinking about it. "I need to go into town today," she said. He looked at her. "What for?" "There are things the kitchen needs, salt mainly, and I'm low on baking powder, and—" She kept her voice level, practical. "I'd like to stop at the county recorder's office, for my own records. When I came out here, I was told I should file notice of my residency with the county. This was not entirely a lie. It was the kind of near truth she'd learned to build when the exact truth wasn't available yet." Thomas studied her for a moment in the unsettling way he had, not suspicious exactly, but attentive in a way that made you aware of how much he was seeing. "Bart's coming today," he said. "I could have him drive you in when he's done with the morning fence work. I can drive myself if you'll lend me the wagon." "You know the road well enough?" "I'll manage." He set down his cup. "All right." He went to the shelf above the door where he kept a tin box, took out some folded bills, and set them on the table. "For the supplies." She picked them up. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. It's ranch money, not charity." He said it without edge, just clarifying. He went back to his coffee. Molly appeared in the doorway in her nightgown, hair everywhere, blinking at the morning. "Are you going to town?" she said to Clara, apparently having absorbed this through the walls. "For a few hours." "Can I—" "No," Thomas said. Molly looked at him, then at Clara. Clara kept her face neutral, which Molly seemed to accept as a kind of solidarity. She came into the kitchen and climbed onto her chair and ate her biscuit with the particular focused silence of a child who knows when adults are not available for negotiation. Red Hollow in the morning was a different thing than Red Hollow at late afternoon. The main street had more movement, more noise, the quality of a town that is at least pretending to be alive. Clara tied the horse at the rail outside the dry goods and went in and bought what she'd said she was buying. Salt, baking powder, a packet of needles she'd been needing. And the woman behind the counter watched her with the same flat curiosity that seemed to be the town's default expression toward her. "You're the Reed woman," the woman said. "I'm staying at the Reed Ranch," Clara said. "Clara Wynne." The woman wrapped the salt. "Elizabeth Reed used to come in every 2-3 weeks. She was a good customer." A pause. "Very organized woman. Always had a list." "She sounds like someone worth knowing," Clara said, and meant it. The woman looked at her sideways. "You settling in out there all right?" "It's coming along. Reed's a hard man to know, not mean, just—" She made a gesture that encompassed the whole difficulty of Thomas Reed without quite describing it. "He's had a time of it. I understand. The ranch has had trouble too, that land dispute with the county, whatever that was about. He doesn't talk about it." She slid the parcel across the counter. "But I expect you'd hear about it sooner or later." Clara paid and left, and did not let herself look back at the woman's expression as she went out the door. The county recorder's office was a narrow building between the land bank and a lawyer's shingle that read Prentice and Son, Attorneys at Law. She stood outside it for a moment, looking at the door, and then went in. The man inside was young, younger than she'd expected for a county official, maybe mid-20s with ink on his fingers and the slightly distracted air of someone managing more paper than any reasonable system should generate. His name, on the nameplate on his desk, was C. Aldrich. "I'm trying to find information about a land challenge," Clara said, "filed sometime around 2 years ago. The parcel would be—" She'd memorized the description from the journal. She gave it to him. He wrote it down and went to the files without asking why she wanted to know. This, she thought, was either the sign of an honest office or an incompetent one, and she was hoping for the former. He came back with a folder and set it on the counter. Challenge was filed, August of 1882. He flipped through the pages. Challenger is listed as E. Reed, Reed Ranch. He looked up. "That's your outfit?" Yes, I'm with the Reed Ranch. Challenge was denied, October 1882. He turned another page. Denied on the grounds that the original sale documentation was complete and properly recorded. Signed off by Judge Allard. He paused. The original sale, though. Looks like there was a question about the prior holder's signature on the transfer deed. Someone flagged it, but the judge found it sufficient. Who flagged it? He looked through this file. The notation just says disputed by Challenger, no witness listed. He closed the folder. There's also a note here. Looks like an inquiry was made around the same time from a law firm in Cheyenne, Harmon and Associates, asking after the status of several parcels in this county. Clara kept her face still. What parcels? Doesn't say specifically, just that an inquiry was made. He looked at her with a mildness that might have been innocence or might have been something practiced. Is there anything else I can help you with? I'd like a copy of the original sale documentation, the one with the questioned signature. I can get that made up. Take a few days. I'll pay for it now and pick it up Friday. She counted out the coins. He took them without comment, made a note, gave her a receipt. She thanked him and left. Outside, she stood on the boardwalk for a moment and let the sun hit her face and thought about what she had, which was not much, and what she needed, which was more, and where to get it without making herself visible to the wrong people before she was ready. She looked at the lawyer's shingle. Prentice and Son. Not Harmon. A different name entirely. She went in. The elder Prentice, there was only an elder. The son, she was told, was in Laramie reading law and would join the practice in the spring. Was a man of 60 or so, white-haired, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, who received her in a small office crowded with case boxes and smelling of pipe tobacco that had been breathed into the walls over many years. "I'm not here to hire you," she said when she sat down. "I want to ask you something, and you can tell me to leave if you don't want to answer it." He looked at her over his glasses. "All right. Harmon and Associates, in Cheyenne. What do you know about them?" The elder Prentice was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable, exactly. More like a man deciding how honestly he wants to spend the next 5 minutes. "They're a territorial law firm," he said carefully. "They handle land and property cases mostly. They've been active in this county for, 4, 5 years. Active how? Acquisitions. They represent buyers of land that comes to sale through the courts, forfeitures, disputed titles, sheriff's sales." He paused. "They're very good at finding land that becomes available through those means. At making it become available?" He looked at her steadily. "I can't say that." "Can't or won't?" A small silence. Miss Wynn, I have practiced law in this county for 22 years. I have a business here, a reputation, and an office that depends on remaining in good standing with the county court." He said this not defensively but precisely, like a man reading from a list of facts. "There are things I can say in this room and things I cannot say." "Then tell me what you can say." He folded his hands on the desk. "Elizabeth Reed was in this office 3 months before she died. She came to me with a set of documents and a theory, a detailed theory with what I thought at the time was suggestive evidence." He stopped. And I told her that without direct documentary proof of forgery, a challenge to a recorded deed in this county was unlikely to succeed, especially given the judicial relationships involved. He looked at his hands. I told her she would need the original documents, or a witness, or both. I told her to be careful. A pause that lasted a beat too long. She thanked me and left, and 3 weeks later she was dead. Clara sat with that. You believed her theory. I thought it merited investigation by someone with more authority than a country lawyer. He met her eyes. I wrote a letter to the federal land office in Cheyenne. I don't know if it was received. I didn't get a reply. She found documents, Claire said. She wrote that she'd found them, before she died. He was very still. You've seen her records. I've seen something. She didn't confirm or deny the journal specifically. If those documents still existed, if someone could produce them, would there be grounds to reopen the challenge, to investigate the judge's ruling? If they showed what I believe Elizabeth believed they showed, he stopped himself, started again more carefully. A federal investigation, yes. The land office can override a county court ruling if there's evidence of fraud, particularly with the new territorial legislation that came through in January. There's a federal marshal assigned to territorial fraud cases out of Cheyenne. He looked at her. His name is Thorne, William Thorne. She committed that name to memory. Thank you, she said, and stood. Miss Wynne. He stood too, which surprised her. An old-fashioned courtesy she wasn't expecting. Be careful, he said. The same advice I gave Elizabeth for whatever it was worth. Something in his face, something that was not quite guilt but was adjacent to it. I should have done more. You're doing something now, she said. That counts for something. She left before he could disagree. The drive back to the ranch was long and warm, and she spent most of it thinking, the horse moving at its own comfortable pace, the land rolling past, the valley wide and still in the midday heat. She thought about what she had: a journal, a denied land challenge, a lawyer who believed something was wrong but couldn't prove it, the name of a federal marshal in Cheyenne. She thought about what she didn't have: the original documents Elizabeth had found, the ones that proved the signatures were forged, the ones that Elizabeth had gone to get and then had died before she could use. I have found the documents. Found them where? The journal hadn't said. Clara turned that over in her mind. The county recorder's office held copies, not originals. The originals of a forged deed would be where? With the people who forged them, locked away, destroyed, or buried in a file box somewhere it would never be found unless someone knew exactly what to look for. Or they were in the place Elizabeth had written she was going, the county recorder's office, where she'd filed the challenge, where a woman named E. Reed had submitted documentation and had it denied by a judge connected to Harmon and Associates. She thought about the young man, Aldrich, with the ink on his fingers and the mildly cooperative manner, the file he'd handed her so readily, the note in the margin about the Harmon inquiry. Too cooperative, maybe. Too easy to find. Or she was becoming paranoid, which was also possible. Suspicion, when it got a grip, didn't always know when to stop. She turned the wagon into the ranch gate and drove up the lane and tried to look like a woman who'd gone to town for salt. Thomas was in the yard when she pulled up, working on something with the fence along the near paddock, his back to her. He turned when he heard the wagon. She set the brake and climbed down with the parcel from the dry goods. Get what you needed? He asked. Yes. She handed him the change from the bills. He pocketed it without counting it, which she noticed. I also stopped at the recorder's office for your residency notice and to ask about the land challenge, the one filed in Elizabeth's name, against the Halverson parcel. He went very still. Not angry, but something closed down in his face, the way a room goes dark when someone shuts the curtains fast. Where did you hear about that? The woman at the dry goods mentioned there'd been trouble with the county. I asked at the recorder's. She held his gaze. I should have asked you first. I'm sorry. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned back to the fence and picked up his pliers. It's done with. Is it? The challenge failed. The judge ruled against it. End of it. The woman who filed that challenge is dead, Clara said, and kept her voice even. Her name is still on it. Your name is on the parcel they were trying to take. She paused. That doesn't feel done to me. It doesn't matter what it feels like. He said it with the exhausted flatness of a man who's hit a wall enough times to stop expecting it to move. I have a ranch to run, Miss Wynne. I have a daughter. I don't have the money or the time Or the... He stopped, pulled a staple from the post, and drove a new one in, harder than necessary. Elizabeth wanted to fight it. She was right to want to, but she's not here, and I am, and I have to deal with what I have. She found documents, Claire said, before she died. She wrote about it. He spun around. His face was... She hadn't seen this from him before. Not the exhaustion or the reserve, but something underneath both of those things. Something raw and unwilling to be looked at. What? She found documents that she believed proved the forged deeds. She wrote about it. Clara didn't move. I don't know where the documents are, but I know she found them. And I know the people who wanted that challenge to fail are still operating in this county. And she stopped herself. This was the moment, the one she'd been building toward and dreading simultaneously. And I know the firm connected to it, Harmon and Associates, because I've dealt with them before. Not here. In Columbus. He stared at her. What are you saying? I'm saying the conviction on my record, the one I didn't tell you about in my letters. She kept her chin up. This was the hard part, the part that felt like stepping off a ledge into darkness. A theft charge, 2 years ago. A property owner in Columbus who used Harmon and Associates. She said it straight, no softening. I didn't steal anything. I was working in a house on the north side and something went missing from it, and I was the easiest explanation. The case was thin enough that a different judge might have thrown it out, but this judge didn't. A pause. I've had 2 years to think about why. This is the first time I've had reason to think there might be an answer. The silence stretched out between them, long and uncomfortable. Thomas Reed stood with the pliers in his hand and looked at her like he was trying to figure out which version of what she'd just said was true. And Clara stood her ground and let him look. You have a conviction, he said finally. Yes. For theft. For a theft I didn't commit. And you didn't tell me. Oh, no. She didn't dress it up. I didn't tell you because I needed to get out of Columbus and I was afraid you'd refuse the arrangement. I'm telling you now because I think it's connected to what happened to your wife, and I think you deserve to know that. She held his gaze. You can ask me to leave. I'll understand it. Another long silence. The afternoon moved around them. The horses in the paddock shifting, the chickens doing their slow random business in the yard, the sound of a hawk somewhere high and lazy above the ridge. You said she found documents, Thomas said. Not you lied to me. Not get off my land. He was choosing what mattered. She respected that. That's what she wrote. I don't know where they are. They could be anywhere. If she was going to the recorder's office... He stopped, thinking. She kept copies of everything. She was meticulous, Elizabeth. Whatever she had, she'd have copied it and put the copy somewhere she thought was safe. Where did she keep her papers? The house. There's a box in the bedroom. I haven't... His jaw tightened. I haven't opened it. Clara understood without needing to be told that Thomas Reed had not opened his wife's belongings in 2 years. That the bedroom probably still had her things in it. That this was not avoidance exactly, but something more like a wound that a man kept clean by not touching. I can look if you want, she said. Or you can. Or we can do it together, but we should do it soon. He looked at her for a long time. Then he set the pliers down on the fence post. After supper, he said, when Molly's in bed. Molly was not easy to put to bed that evening. She was in one of her moods. Not bad exactly, but wound up, full of questions and observations and half-finished stories about things that had happened at the ranch while Clara was in town, delivered in the rapid-fire way she had when she was trying to keep hold of an adult's attention and sensed it drifting. Clara listened and answered and listened more, and eventually got her through the washing up and into her nightgown and into bed, where she lay looking at the ceiling with the energy of a child who knows sleep is expected and resents it. You and Papa were talking serious outside, Molly said, when you came back. We were talking about some ranch business. It didn't look like ranch business. Molly. What? Go to sleep. Molly turned on her side. A silence. Then, Clara. Are you going to stay? Clara paused in the doorway. The lamp was low, the room warm. Molly was watching her from the pillow with the particular look of a child asking a question they've been holding for a while. I don't know yet, Clara said. But I'm not going anywhere tonight. Molly seemed to accept this as enough. She closed her eyes. Clara went back downstairs. Thomas was already in the bedroom. She could see the lamplight under the door, and when she knocked and came in, he was standing at the wardrobe, not opening it, just standing in front of it with his arms at his sides. The room was spare: a bed, a chest of drawers, a wardrobe, a window facing west. Nothing of Elizabeth's was visibly out, but the whole room had a stillness that wasn't dust or neglect, more like preservation, like a man who'd learned to move around a thing without disturbing it. "It's in here," he said. He opened the wardrobe. On the lower shelf, beside a pair of women's boots and a hat box, there was a tin box with a brass latch. He lifted it out and set it on the chest of drawers and stepped back, and Clara came forward and opened it. Letters, receipts, a folded map of the valley with parcels marked in ink, and underneath all of that, a smaller envelope, unsealed, containing a folded set of papers that felt different from the rest, stiffer, more deliberate. She unfolded them carefully. They were copies. Copies of documents, deed transfer records, 2 of them, and a court filing from the judge's chambers. The signatures on the deed transfers were marked in Elizabeth's hand with small notations. Compare to original on file. Do not match TR Sig, dated 1879. Next to one of them, she had written a name, Aldrich. Clara stared at that name. See. Aldrich, the young man at the recorder's office with the ink on his fingers who'd handed her the file so easily. Who'd noted the Harmon inquiry so casually. Aldrich. She knew, Clara said, almost to herself. What? Thomas moved closer and looked at the papers over her shoulder. She knew who in the recorder's office was part of it. This name, she pointed. I met him today. He's the county recorder now. Thomas said nothing for a moment. She could feel him reading over her shoulder, could sense the specific quality of his silence changing. Not grief this time. Something harder. The judge's signature on this, he said, pointing to the court filing. That's Allard. He ruled against the challenge. He's connected to Harmon, the lawyer in town told me. Prentice, Thomas said it flatly. Not surprised exactly, but something. He believes Elizabeth was right. He said she came to him before... Clara stopped. Then carefully. He thinks she was killed, not an accident. Thomas stepped back from the chest of drawers. She turned to look at him. His face was doing something she hadn't seen before. A controlled internal movement that was not quite falling apart, was in fact very deliberately not falling apart, but showed the effort of that in the set of his jaw and the particular stillness of his hands. He was a man learning something he'd been trying not to know for 2 years. The loft door, Clara said gently. Molly told me it was always latched from the inside. Elizabeth used to latch it herself. He closed his eyes for a moment. Just one. I knew, he said. Not an admission exactly, more like a word he'd been holding a very long time, finding its way out. I knew it didn't. I looked at that door after. The latch wasn't broken. A woman doesn't fall through a latched door. He opened his eyes. But there was no proof, and the sheriff ruled it an accident, and I had Molly and the ranch, and I couldn't... He stopped. I told myself it was grief, that I was seeing things that weren't there because I wanted something to blame. You weren't, Clara said. No, he said. I wasn't. They stood in the lamplight in Elizabeth's room with her papers spread on the chest of drawers between them, and neither of them said anything for a while. There wasn't much to say. Some things, when they finally come clear, take a moment before words are useful again. Then Thomas straightened. What do we do with this? These copies aren't enough on their own, Clara said. We need the originals or a federal authority who can compel them. There's a marshal, Thorne, out of Cheyenne, who handles territorial fraud cases. If we can get word to him, and if we can show him enough to open an investigation, Harmon will know, Thomas said. If we make a move, they'll know. They have eyes in the county office. I know. She looked at the papers. Aldrich saw me today. He saw what I asked for. Thomas went very still in a new way. You think they already know you've been looking. I think it's possible. He looked at her, really looked at her, the careful, assessing look he'd been directing at her for 3 weeks, but different now, less like a man taking measure of a stranger, more like a man looking at someone he's already standing next to. You came here and you didn't know any of this. No. But you ended up in the middle of it anyway. Apparently Harmon and Associates has a long reach, she said dryly. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. He was too tired and the situation was too heavy, but the shadow of one. I'm sorry I didn't meet you at the station, he said. She looked at him. That's what you're thinking about right now? I'm thinking about a lot of things. That's one of them. He picked up the papers and folded them carefully. We need somewhere to keep these that isn't the house. The barn, she said. There's a loose board in the back corner of the loft, left side. I noticed it when I was moving things. He looked at her. You've been here 3 weeks. I noticed things. She said it without apology. It's kept me alive this long. He held her gaze for a moment, and she saw something in it that hadn't been there before. Not trust exactly, not yet, but the beginning of it. The first boards of something that might eventually hold weight. He put the papers into the tin box and they went out of the room together, leaving the lamp burning low behind them. The house was quiet. Molly slept. Outside, the ranch was dark in the way frontier land goes dark. Completely, without apology, the stars the only light for miles. Clara held the tin box and walked beside Thomas through the dark yard to the barn, and thought about the footsteps in the hallway the night before, and the name Aldrich written in Elizabeth Reed's careful hand, and the way the county recorder had watched her leave his office with the particular attention of a man filing something away for later use. They put the box behind the loose board in the loft and fit the board back into place and climbed down in silence. At the barn door, Thomas stopped. In Columbus, he said. The conviction. You served time? 6 months, she said. Then they released me on account of overcrowding, which was the closest thing to luck I'd had in 2 years. He nodded slowly. Not forgiving exactly. She hadn't asked him to forgive anything, but taking it in, adding it to what he knew. We'll write to Thorne in the morning, he said. I'll send Bart with the letter. He goes to Cheyenne every 3 weeks for supplies. When does he go next? 4 days? All right. She turned to go back to the house. He said her name. Miss Wynne. She turned back. Clara. He corrected himself, using it for the first time. Whatever happens, whatever they try to put on you, you're not doing this alone. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without decoration. But it landed in the way plain things do when someone means them completely. She looked at him for a moment in the dark outside the barn. Neither are you, she said. She went back to the house. At the door, she stopped for just a second and listened to the night. The animals, the wind low in the grass, the silence that was not quite silence. Nothing. No footsteps. No creak of board. She went inside and latched her door and lay down. And this time she slept, though not deeply and not for long, because 4 days was not much time. And somewhere between Red Hollow and Cheyenne, someone already knew what she'd asked for. Bart did not make it to Cheyenne. He left on the 3rd morning with the letter tucked inside his coat. Thomas had written it himself the night before. At the kitchen table, with Clara sitting across from him going over what to include and what to leave out, how much to say to a man neither of them had met, how to make a case in a single page that wouldn't sound like the ravings of a grieving rancher and a woman with a criminal record. They'd argued about the wording twice. Not badly, not with heat, but with the particular friction of two people who think differently about how much trust a stranger deserves. Thomas wanted to say everything. Clara wanted to say enough. If we say too much, it looks desperate, she said. Desperate people get managed, not believed. If we say too little, he won't come. We say, a federal land fraud case with documentation connected to Harmon and Associates, a judge, and a county official. That's enough. That's the kind of list a federal marshal takes seriously. Thomas looked at what he'd written, crossed out 2 sentences, kept the rest. Bart took the letter and left at first light, in a good mood the way Bart usually was in the morning. He was a simple and essentially cheerful man who liked his work and his 3-week supply runs to Cheyenne and was not given to asking questions about things that weren't his concern. Clara watched the wagon turn up the lane and disappear past the gate and felt, for 1 hour, something approaching relief. The relief did not survive the afternoon. She was in the kitchen garden, the one she'd been slowly reclaiming from neglect, pulling the last of the volunteer weeds from between the bean rows, when she heard the horses. Not the sound of a single rider coming up the lane at a working pace. Multiple horses, moving with the deliberate authority of men who expect to be waited for. She straightened and shielded her eyes. 3 riders. The man in front was wearing a badge she could see glinting from 20 yards out. Sheriff Calhoun. She would learn his name in the next 2 minutes, though she'd seen him once before in town at a distance. A broad man, not fat, but thick in the way of someone who'd been physically imposing in his youth and had let time settle the weight differently. He had the face of a man who'd been given authority early and had never quite gotten over it. The 2 men behind him were deputies. One of them had her bag. Her bag. The canvas one with a repaired strap that she'd left in the spare room. She set down her weeding tool and stood there in the garden with dirt on her hands and her heart going very quiet and careful inside her chest, the way it had learned to go quiet and careful when she was 24 years old, and a man in a good suit had come into her employer's house and pointed at her. Thomas came out of the barn. He'd heard the horses, too. "Thomas Reed," the sheriff said without dismounting, "and this would be—" He looked at Clara with the particular look of a man who's been given a description and is confirming it. "Clara Wynne." "That's right," Clara said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Miss Wynne, I'm Sheriff Calhoun. I have a warrant for your arrest." "On what charge?" "Theft." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document, specifically theft of property belonging to one Mr. Gerald Harmon, of Harmon and Associates, Cheyenne, filed 3 days ago with the Territorial Court. He looked at her with something that wasn't quite satisfaction but was close to it. The arrest warrant was executed this morning, 3 days ago, before she'd gone to town, before she'd spoken to Aldrich, to Prentice, to anyone, which meant the warrant had been filed before anyone in Red Hollow could have known she was looking, which meant someone had known she was coming before she arrived, before she'd been on the train. Someone had reached back that far, had seen her name on the Correspondence Bureau's records, and had moved. She thought about that in the 3 seconds she had before Calhoun swung down from his horse. "Thomas," she looked at him. He was standing at the barn door with his jaw set and his face doing the thing it did when he was containing something large. "The document copies we talked about. They need to be looked at by someone—" "Miss Wynne," Calhoun said, moving toward her. "Thomas." She kept her eyes on him. "Prentice. Remember what I told you about Prentice?" "All right," Thomas said. His voice was flat and controlled. "All right, Clara." Calhoun took her arm. Not roughly, not yet, but with the practiced grip of a man who's done this before and knows how to make it feel inevitable. The deputy with her bag held it out, and Calhoun took it and handed it to his other deputy. She let herself be moved toward the horses because there was no other option, not with Molly about to come out of the house at any moment, not with Thomas standing there with his hands forming fists at his sides. She turned once before they put her on a horse. Thomas was still at the barn door. He hadn't moved. "The fence along the eastern border," she said to him, and she made her voice calm and ordinary, like she was reminding him of a chore. "Molly told me it's been needing work for a while." He looked at her for a moment. Something went across his face that she didn't have words for, and then he nodded. Once. She turned and let the deputy help her onto the horse, and they rode out of the Reed Ranch yard, and she didn't look back again. Red Hollow's jail was a single room behind the sheriff's office, with 2 cells divided by a wall of iron bars and a window too small and too high to be useful for anything except measuring the passage of light. Clara sat on the bench in the left cell and looked at the wall and listened to Calhoun's boots on the floor outside as he settled back into whatever he'd been doing before riding out to arrest her. The cell smelled of old wood and something else, not quite fear, more like the residue of many different people's bad situations left layered into the walls over years. She'd been in a cell before. Columbus. She'd been 25 then and badly frightened and had spent most of the first day trying not to show it. She was 27 now and frightened again, but differently. Not the blank animal fear of something happening to you that you don't understand, but the cold specific dread of someone who understands exactly what is happening and knows how narrow the margin is. She went through what she had. Thomas knew. That was the most important thing. He knew about Harmon, about Prentice, about the copies in the barn. He had the name William Thorne. Bart had left this morning with the letter, unless someone stopped him, which was possible. But Bart was just a hired hand buying supplies in Cheyenne, not a person that Harmon and Associates would have noted or flagged. The letter might get through. Might. She didn't have much control over might. What she could control was what she said in this cell, and to whom. Calhoun had not asked her any questions yet, which meant either he was not very good at his job or he was waiting for someone. She suspected the latter. Men who make arrests on 3-day-old warrants filed in Cheyenne on behalf of a law firm they're connected to do not tend to be working alone. She was right about the waiting. Around mid-afternoon, the front door of the sheriff's office opened, and a different set of boots came through, lighter, with the particular deliberate quality of a man who's practiced not making noise. The man who appeared at the cell door was not large. He was perhaps 40, slight, well-dressed for this county in a way that read as deliberate, with the smooth, careful face of someone who'd spent years managing his own expressions. He had light eyes and a quality of attention that reminded Clara of a man reading a balance sheet. Everything measured, everything reduced to what it was worth. "Miss Wynne," he said pleasantly, "my name is Colton. I represent Harmon and Associates." "I know who you are," she said. She didn't exactly. She hadn't seen him before, but she knew the type, and she was fairly certain she knew what he was here to offer. He smiled. It was a practice smile, not warm. "Then I'll save us both the preamble. The charge against you is serious. Theft of property belonging to a principal of a significant territorial law firm. That's not something a woman in your circumstances weathers easily, particularly given your prior conviction." He paused. "However, my clients are not interested in pursuing criminal proceedings against you personally." "What are they interested in?" "A simple thing." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper and held it up, not close enough for her to read. "A statement, signed and witnessed, attesting that you came to Red Hollow under false pretenses, that you entered the Reed Ranch property and discovered certain documents belonging to the estate, and that you removed those documents without permission." He said all of this with the calm of someone reciting a grocery list. "In exchange for that statement, the charges against you are dropped. You're free to leave Wyoming. We can even arrange passage." Clara looked at him through the bars. "And the Reed Ranch?" "Mr. Reed will be given a fair opportunity to resolve his outstanding land obligations through the court." He said this with the specific blandness of a man who knows exactly what that means and is counting on her not to. "Outstanding land obligations that were fabricated using forged deeds and a corrupt judge," she said. Something shifted in his expression, just slightly, like a man recalculating. "The documents you're referring to are not what you believe them to be. A full legal examination would show what Elizabeth Reed already knew," Clara said, "which is why she was killed before she could file them." The pleasant expression went away, not replaced by anything threatening, more like a mask removed to show not a face but an absence of one. "Miss Wynne," he said quietly, "you are in a cell in a county where my clients have significant relationships with the court and the law enforcement. You have a prior conviction. You have no legal representation and no family." He let that settle. "Whatever you believe you know, you have nothing to prove it with, and no one here is inclined to let you try." She held his gaze. "Then why are you here?" she said. "If I have nothing and no one, you don't need me to sign anything. You can just leave me in here." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him doing the calculation she'd intended. If she's nothing, why are we worried? What does she have? Where did she put it? "I'll give you until tomorrow morning to think about the offer," he said finally, and walked away. She heard the front door close behind him. She sat back against the cell wall and let out a breath that she'd been holding, she realized, for most of that conversation. Then she counted what that conversation had told her. Colton didn't know where the documents were. He knew she'd been to the recorder's office, probably knew she'd been to Prentice, but he didn't know about the barn loft. He didn't know about Elizabeth's journal. He was fishing, and he'd come here in person to do it, which meant they were less certain than they wanted to be. That was something, a thin something, but she held on to it. Tusk. The night was long. The deputy on evening watch, young, maybe 20, with the self-conscious officiousness of someone new to authority, brought her water and a bowl of something that might have been stew at some point in its history, and she ate it because not eating was foolish. And she tried to sleep on the bench and managed an hour, maybe 2, before the discomfort woke her. She lay in the dark and thought about Molly, not in a sentimental way, She didn't have the luxury of sentiment right now, but practically. Molly knew things. Molly had been living in that house for 7 years and had the particular quality of attention that children develop when the adults around them are frequently preoccupied with things they don't explain. She'd known about the loft latch. She'd known something about her mother's death that her father hadn't told her and possibly didn't know himself. Whatever Thomas was doing right now, and she had to trust that he was doing something, had to trust that because the alternative was to stop thinking. Molly would be watching, and Molly would be filing things away. She hoped Thomas had the sense to keep the girl close and not let her near anyone from the county until this was resolved. Sometime in the deep middle of the night, she heard the front door open. Not the deputies shuffling, a different sound entirely. Quieter, purposeful, the sound of someone who knew the building. She sat up on the bench. A voice, low, behind the door. Then another voice, Calhoun's, and what might have been an argument conducted at whisper volume. Then the door to the cell area opened, and the lamp the deputy carried showed her two things at once. Calhoun in his undershirt, obviously pulled from sleep, and Aldrich, the county recorder, in a coat that still had town dust on it, carrying a leather case. Aldrich looked at her through the bars without embarrassment. "Miss Wynne." He set the leather case on the small table outside the cells and opened it. "I need you to look at something." "I don't have to look at anything." "No," he agreed, "but you might want to." Calhoun leaned against the wall with the expression of a man who doesn't like the current situation but has been persuaded it's necessary. Aldrich took a document from the case, a single page, heavy paper, official-looking, and held it up to the bars. "This is a transfer deed for the Reed Ranch parcel. Original." He turned it so she could see the signature line. "Thomas Reed, signed 1879. You're looking at the signature." She looked. She'd seen the notation in Elizabeth's copies. "Do not match TR's signature dated 1879. She'd never seen the original to compare. She looked at this signature. "Now this," Aldrich said, and produced a second document. "Transfer to Harmon Land Interests. Executed, according to the date, 1882, Thomas Reed signing over the eastern parcel." She looked at the second signature, then back at the first. They were close, very close. Someone had practiced, had studied the original, had gotten the general shape of it. But the pressure was wrong. The second signature pressed harder on the downstrokes, lighter on the cross of the T, and the reed was missing the slight backward lean the man put on his own name. She'd seen Thomas write his name twice. She remembered it clearly. "You're showing me this," she said slowly. "Why?" Aldrich looked uncomfortable. It was the first genuinely human expression she'd seen from him. "Because I have children," he said. "And Elizabeth Reed was a decent woman who found something she shouldn't have found and died for it. And Colton came to my office this afternoon and told me to locate any copies that might still be on file and destroy them." He paused. "I didn't." Clara looked at him. "You're part of this." "I was part of it." He said it flatly, not asking for anything from her. "I recorded documents I knew were wrong because Harmon's office made it very clear what happened to county officials who raised objections. I've been living with that." He put the documents back in the case. "I can't undo what I did, but I can give these to someone who can use them." "You should give them to Thomas Reed," Clara said. "Tonight, not tomorrow." "I can't go to the ranch tonight without raising—" "Then give them to Prentice." She watched his face. "You know who Prentice is. Everyone in this county knows. He's not connected to Harmon. He's been sitting on what he knows for 2 years because he didn't have documentation. Now you do." She pressed forward. "And there's a federal marshal, Thorne, out of Cheyenne. We've already sent word. If Thorne's office receives a package of original documents from the county recorder, along with a written statement, which—" "Dear me, a statement implicating me," Aldrich said. "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. Calhoun made a sound that might have been disgust or agreement, impossible to say. "If I do this," Aldrich said, "and Harmon's people get to me before the marshal, then don't wait," Clara said. "Do it tonight, now, before Colton knows you've been here." Another silence. Calhoun pushed off the wall and went out to the front room without comment, leaving them. Aldrich stood there with his leather case and his family and his 2 years of guilt, and Clara sat on her bench and looked at him and did not offer him easy absolution because she didn't have it to give and wouldn't have given it if she had. "There's one more thing," he said finally. The original documents that Elizabeth found. We've never been able to locate them. If they still exist, they exist, Clara said. They're in a safe place, and they'll be with Prentice by morning if Thomas Reed gets word tonight. Aldrich nodded. He closed the case. I'll go to Prentice, he said, and your written statement. Yes. He said it like a man stepping off something high. And the statement. He left. The cell area went dark again. Clara lay back down on the bench and looked at the ceiling and felt something that was not quite hope. Too early for hope. And she'd learned to be suspicious of it anyway. But was the functional equivalent of it. A direction. A sense that the thing was in motion now, that she'd put enough pieces in play that even from inside a cell, she could still exert pressure on the shape of what happened next. She also knew that by morning, Colton would know she hadn't taken his offer. And men like Colton, when their first approach doesn't work, rarely wait long before trying a different one. Morning came gray and close, clouds building in from the west in a way that meant rain by afternoon. Clara was awake when Calhoun came in with coffee, real coffee, which surprised her, and set it on the small ledge by the bars without meeting her eyes. Sheriff, she said. He paused. How long have you been working with them? He looked at the floor. He was a big man, and in the gray morning light, he looked tired in a way that went beyond last night's interrupted sleep. Since before Elizabeth Reed filed that challenge, he said. Since before. He said it like a confession, and then walked out of it immediately, the way people do when they say something true that they then can't stand to have hanging in the air. He went back to the front room. She drank the coffee. An hour later, the front door opened with more noise and authority than she'd heard it use yet, and she heard Thomas Reed's voice before she heard anyone else's. I want to see her, he said. Not loud, but absolute. Now wait, Calhoun's voice. I'm not waiting. You have no evidence to hold her on past the initial period, and you know it. That warrant was filed on a fraudulent basis by a party with a direct interest in removing her from this county, and I have a lawyer in this building in 20 minutes who will make that case in front of any judge you want to call. A pause. Except Allard. Don't call Allard. Clara set down the coffee cup. The cell room door opened and Thomas came through, and behind him, to her considerable surprise, was Prentice. Not the tired, cautious version of Prentice she'd met in his dusty office. This version was carrying a briefcase and had combed his hair, and had the look of a man who had decided sometime in the night that 22 years of careful avoidance was enough. Thomas stopped at the cell door. He looked at her with the thorough, checking look of a man accounting for damage. She was fine. Tired, sore from the bench, but fine, and she let him see that. Aldrich came to me at midnight, Prentice said, moving to stand beside Thomas, with original documents and a signed statement. I've been up since. He opened the briefcase and she could see the edges of the papers inside. We have what we need to file a federal complaint. I sent a writer at 4 a.m. to Cheyenne. Bart had a letter, Thomas said. He made it through. I got word this morning. Thorne's office acknowledged receipt. Clara breathed. Just once. Slow. Colton's going to move, she said. When he finds out about Aldrich, he'll find out this morning, Prentice said. So will we be moving. I'm going to Calhoun now. There are grounds to dismiss this warrant, and I intend to argue them. He looked at her through the bars with something in his face that she thought might be the closest he could come to an apology for the conversation they'd had 2 years ago, filtered through Elizabeth Reed's death, filtered through all the things he'd known and not acted on. It may take a few hours, but you'll be out of here today. Today, Thomas repeated. To her, not to Prentice. Like a promise. She looked at him. He had come into town without Molly. She could see that. And his shirt wasn't quite right, like he'd dressed in a hurry in the dark. And his jaw carried 2 days of growth, and he'd ridden hard because she could see it in the set of his shoulders. He was not a man who was comfortable with urgency, who was built for the quick, decisive action of a crisis. He was a man built for long, grinding, enduring work. And he'd done the urgent thing anyway, in the night, because she was here. Where's Molly? She asked. With May Hollis, the woman 2 farms east. His jaw tightened slightly. Molly didn't want to go. I imagine she didn't. She told May she was going to be a lawyer when she grew up so nobody could put her friends in jail. Something in Clara's chest did a thing she wasn't expecting and didn't have a name for immediately. She's 7, she said. 7 3/4. She's very specific about that. Prentice cleared his throat. I'm going to speak with Calhoun now. He left them. Thomas stood at the cell door. Clara stood on the other side of it. The distance between them was maybe 3 feet, and the bars and everything else that had accumulated in 4 weeks of living in close proximity and learning each other sideways. I went to the barn last night, he said quietly. The box is still there. Good. I also went through the rest of the loft, the things I moved when you were sorting. He paused. There was a second envelope behind the loose board, not the one we found, another one. She went very still. Elizabeth had put it there herself, he said, before she died. Inside it were the original documents, the deed transfers, with the real signatures alongside the forged ones. Everything she said she'd found. He met her eyes. She hid them in the barn because she knew the house might be searched, and she latched the loft door from the inside the way she always did. His voice didn't break. He wouldn't let it. She was careful until the end. Clara pressed her palm flat against the bar, not reaching through, just placing it there. They're in Prentice's hands now, Thomas said. The originals, along with the journal, which I brought this morning. He looked at her hand on the bar and then at her face. When they let you out of here, we need to talk about what comes next. I know. Whatever Harmon does in the next few days, and they'll do something, it's going to come at the ranch, at me, at the land title, maybe at Molly. They have the judge, and they have Calhoun, and they're going to try something before Thorne can get here from Cheyenne. I know, she said again. Clara. The way he said her name now was different from the first time, different from even a day ago. Not the stiff correction of Miss Wynne to something more appropriate, something else. You don't have to stay for this part. You've done more than you agreed to, more than anyone could reasonably. Thomas, she said. He stopped. I'm not going anywhere. She said it the same way he'd said things to her, flat, plain, no decoration. You told me 2 nights ago I wasn't doing this alone. I'm telling you the same. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached out and covered her hand on the bar with his own, briefly, and then let go. He went out to find Prentice. She sat back on the bench and watched the light change in the small high window and listened to the sound of voices in the front room. Prentice, Calhoun, Thomas, someone else she didn't recognize, and felt the shape of the next few days pressing in around her. It wasn't over. It was barely the middle. Harmon and Associates had money and connections and 2 years of practice at making problems disappear, and she was a woman with a criminal record in a county where the judge and the sheriff had both been working for the other side. And even with Aldrich's statement and the original documents and a federal marshal somewhere on a road between here and Cheyenne, there was no guarantee of how it went. She knew that. She'd known it since she was 25 years old in a Columbus courtroom and learned the hard way that the truth was not by itself enough, that it needed someone to carry it, and the carrier mattered as much as the truth. But she also had something she hadn't had in Columbus. She had Thomas, who was in the next room fighting for her in the deliberate way of a man who does not take action lightly and therefore means it when he does. She had Prentice, who had finally decided that 2 years of careful avoidance was not something he could continue to live with. She had Aldrich's statement and Elizabeth's documents and her own hard, lean knowledge of how these systems worked from the inside. And she had Molly, somewhere on a farm 2 miles east, telling May Hollis she was going to be a lawyer. The front room went quiet for a long moment. Then she heard Calhoun's voice, low and resigned, and the sound of keys. The cell door opened. She stood up and walked out. Prentice was already putting papers in his briefcase. Thomas was at the front door, not quite in the room anymore, one boot on the threshold, watching her come through the cell area with an expression she didn't try to read because some things are better left unread until there's time to read them properly. Calhoun handed her bag back without looking at her. She took it and felt the weight of it. The journal was gone from the hidden pocket, which meant Thomas had taken it, which was right. Outside, Red Hollow was going about its morning. Men on the boardwalk, a wagon being loaded outside the hardware. The station agent at his window. None of them looking at her, which was different from how they'd looked last time. Not because the town had changed its opinion, but because there were horses in front of the sheriff's office that hadn't been there before. And people in small towns know when something is moving and give it a certain amount of room. Thomas came down the steps beside her. I have the wagon, he said. Prentice is coming out to the ranch this afternoon to go through everything. And until Thorn arrives? We keep the originals with Prentice. We stay on the ranch. We watch what comes. He glanced at her. And we fix the fence along the eastern border. She looked at him. You told me to remember, he said. When they were taking you, you said the fence needed work. I said it because you needed something concrete to hold on to. She adjusted the strap on her bag. Does the fence actually need work? The fence always needs work, he said. They walked to the wagon. The clouds were coming in thicker now, the air changing with the weight of rain moving toward them from the west, and the town was getting smaller in the wagon behind them as they turned south. And Clara Wynne sat beside Thomas Reed on the bench seat with her bag between her feet and her hands in her lap, and thought about all the kinds of holding on there were, and how some of them looked like nothing from the outside, and how that was the most important kind. She did not think about Colton, though he was somewhere in Red Hollow behind them, making calculations. She would think about Colton later. Right now she thought about Molly and the fence and the way the valley looked when the rain came in from the west and turned everything gray-green and alive, and the particular feeling of being in a fight that wasn't over, but that, for the first time, felt like a fight she was actually in rather than one being done to her. That was a different thing. That was a new thing. She held it for the whole ride back. The rain came in just as they reached the gate. It didn't build slowly the way rain sometimes does in that country, giving you time to get under cover before it means it. It came all at once, the sky dropping straight to the earth without ceremony, and by the time Thomas had the horse into the barn and unhitched, both of them were soaked through. Clara wrung out the hem of her dress over the barn floor drain and said nothing about it, and Thomas shook water from his hat and said nothing either. And for a moment they just stood in the barn with the rain hammering the roof, and the horse steaming slightly from the run, and the smell of wet earth coming in through every gap in the boards. I'll get the stove going, Clara said. I'll bring Molly back from the Hollis farm. In this? It'll let up. He looked at the roof like he was reading something. Give it an hour. He was right about the hour. She had the stove going and coffee made, and her wet things hung by the time the rain eased to a thin drizzle, and Thomas came back with Molly riding in front of him on the horse, wrapped in a borrowed oilskin that was 3 sizes too large for her, and extremely pleased with herself about it. Molly slid down from the horse and ran to Clara and stopped just short of her, which was the most restrained physical greeting she'd managed in 4 weeks. She looked at Clara's face with the careful attention of a child checking for damage. You're all right, she said. A statement, not a question. Confirming. I'm all right. I told May Hollis the sheriff was wrong, Molly said. She said I shouldn't say things like that about the sheriff. I said she could tell me I was wrong when he stopped being wrong. She looked back at Thomas. Was that bad? It was accurate, Thomas said, and hung the oilskin on the peg by the door. Molly turned back to Clara. Can I help with supper? You can set the table. This was enough. Molly went inside, and the ordinary business of the evening resumed around them, the way ordinary life has a habit of reasserting itself, even when the ground underneath it is not yet stable. Clara cooked, and Molly set the table, and Thomas washed the day off him at the pump outside and came in damp-haired and slightly less tightly wound, and they ate together in the kitchen with the rain still talking quietly at the windows. Prentice arrived at 7, as he'd said he would. He came in looking like a man who'd spent the afternoon discovering that what he thought was a manageable problem was, in fact, a much larger one, and had decided to manage it anyway. He set his briefcase on the kitchen table and accepted the coffee Clara put in front of him and got to it without preamble. I've been through everything, he said. The originals from the barn, Aldrich's statement, the journal, the copies Elizabeth made. It's a comprehensive case, a genuinely comprehensive case. He said this with a kind of reluctant admiration that Clara suspected was directed partly at Elizabeth Reed and partly at whatever system had made him wait 2 years to say it. 3 parcels in this county taken by Harmon, interest through fraudulent title transfers over 5 years. Judge Allard's signature appears on the denial of each challenge. Aldrich's statement confirms he recorded documents he knew to be improperly executed. He looked at Thomas. Your wife built this case from scratch. She didn't miss much. Thomas had his hands around his coffee cup. She didn't miss anything, he said. She never did. Prentice gave him a moment. Then, the question is timeline. Thorne's office acknowledged the letter, but acknowledgement isn't arrival. Cheyenne is 3 days hard ride in good weather. More in this. He glanced at the window. I would estimate we have until the end of the week before anyone with federal authority is physically present in this county. And Harmon's people won't wait that long, Clara said. No. He opened his briefcase and spread several pages on the table. Colton came to my office this afternoon, after the jail. He was... A pause. He was very polite. He made it clear that Aldrich's statement could be challenged on the grounds of coercion, that the documents could be disputed as to chain of custody, that the warrant against you, Clara, though dismissed, could be refiled with additional supporting evidence. He looked at her over his glasses. He also suggested that a fire can start from almost anywhere on a ranch, if conditions are right. The kitchen went quiet. Molly, who had been sitting at the far end of the table with a book, looked up. "Go read in your room, Molly," Thomas said. She looked at him, then at Clara, then at Prentice. She went, which Clara counted as a small victory of trust. "He threatened you directly," Thomas said, when her footsteps had reached the top of the stairs. "He was very indirect about it," Prentice said. "That's how these things work. Plausible phrasing, implausible innocence." He gathered the pages. "But we have something they don't know we have." "Which is?" "Aldrich kept copies of the originals before he handed them over, in a location I'm not going to specify out loud." He looked at both of them. "And he's agreed to present himself to Thorne's office in Cheyenne directly, in person, rather than waiting for the marshal to arrive here. He left this evening on the stage." He let that land. If something happens to the documents here, fire, theft, whatever Colton is considering, the copies and the testimony still exist. Harmon can't destroy what they don't know is in Cheyenne. Clara looked at him with something approaching genuine respect. "You did that today." "I did that today." He said it without taking much credit, the way people do when they've done the right thing late and know it. "It doesn't solve everything. We still need Thorne here, and we still need to keep the originals safe, and both of you..." He looked at them. "Present and unharmed and unimplicated in anything new between now and then." "What does that mean, specifically?" Thomas asked. "It means don't go to Calhoun. Don't go to Judge Allard with anything. Don't make any moves in the county offices that give Harmon an excuse to file new actions." He looked at Clara particularly. "And Miss Wynne, I'm going to formally request in writing that the territorial court recognize your prior conviction as potentially tainted by an interested third party. That takes time, but it puts it on the record." "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet." He closed the briefcase. "Thank me when Thorne arrives, and this is in federal hands." He stood, buttoned his coat. At the door he paused. Elizabeth deserved better than she got from this county, from me, among others. He looked at Thomas. "I intend to finish what she started." He left. The rain had stopped by then, the night clear and cold the way Wyoming nights go cold fast after summer rain, the stars coming back out sharp and close. Thomas stood at the door after Prentice left and looked out at the dark yard for a long moment, and Clara stood at the kitchen table and watched him do it, and neither of them spoke for a while. "She would have liked you," he said finally, not turning around. Clara wasn't sure what to say to that. "Elizabeth," he said, "she would have seen you clearly and liked what she saw." He turned then. I'm not saying it to mean anything beyond what it is." "I know," Clara said. He nodded, went to bank the stove for the night. She washed the cups and thought about Elizabeth Reed, who had mapped a conspiracy in a leather journal and hidden the proof in a barn loft and gone alone to a county office to file a challenge that got her killed, and who had latched the loft door carefully because she'd always been careful, and who had raised a daughter that told county officials they were wrong and meant it at age 7, and who had married a man who still couldn't say her name without something moving behind his eyes. She thought, I would have liked her too. The next 3 days had the particular quality of waiting under pressure. The kind of waiting where you keep moving, keep doing ordinary things, but every sound from the lane and every rider visible from the kitchen window becomes something to assess before it becomes something to ignore. Bart came back from Cheyenne on the second day and reported, with the careful neutrality of a man relaying information he doesn't entirely understand, that the Federal Land Office building in Cheyenne had seemed busy, and that there had been more horses tied outside it than usual for a Tuesday, and that a man matching the description of Aldrich had been seen going into a building on the main block and not coming out for several hours. This was not conclusive, but it was something. Clara worked. She worked the way she always worked when things were uncertain, methodically, with her hands, because her hands didn't need her brain to be elsewhere in order to do their job. She finished reclaiming the kitchen garden, which had been a month's incremental project, and was now producing beans and late tomatoes and a respectable amount of squash. She mended the curtains in the front room, which had been deteriorating in a specific way that required either ignoring or addressing, and she addressed them. She helped Molly with letters and arithmetic at the kitchen table in the evenings, which had become a routine somewhere in the last few weeks without either of them formally establishing it. Molly was not, as it turned out, behind in her letters. She was quite far ahead of them, and what she actually needed was not drilling, but someone willing to answer the questions the letters led her to, which were numerous and not always simple. "What's habeas corpus?" she asked on the second evening. Claire looked up from the mending she was doing alongside the lesson. "Where did you read that?" Mr. Prentice's briefcase had a paper sticking out. I could see the top part. "You shouldn't read other people's papers." "I only read the part that was sticking out." Molly waited with the patience of someone who knows the answer is coming regardless. "It's a legal concept," Clara said. "It means that if someone is arrested, a court can be asked to examine whether the arrest is lawful, whether there's a real reason to hold them." She paused. "It's a protection against being kept in a place without proper cause." Molly considered this. "Like what happened to you? Like what they tried to do to me? Yes." "So the law can be wrong," Molly said. "But there are parts of the law that can fix the wrong parts. When they're used correctly, when people are willing to use them." Molly turned this over. "Why wouldn't people use them?" "Because using them has a cost," Clara said. "It takes money and time, and sometimes it makes enemies. People who could fix wrong things decide the cost is too high." She kept her voice even, not bitter, just accurate. "That's not always cowardice. Sometimes it's circumstances. But sometimes it is cowardice." "Mr. Prentice wasn't cowardly," Molly said. "He came. He came late," Clara said. "But he came. That counts." Molly nodded, apparently satisfied with the moral complexity of this, and went back to her letters. Thomas passed through the kitchen during this exchange, heard most of it, and said nothing. But later, after Molly was in bed, he came into the kitchen where Clara was still at the table and sat down across from her and said, "She's going to be something, that girl." "She already is something," Claire said. "She just needs someone to not waste it." He looked at her for a moment. "Is that what you're doing? Not wasting it?" "I'm trying," she said. "I don't know what I'm doing most of the time. With her. I didn't have anyone to learn from." "Neither did I," Thomas said. "I've been making it up since Elizabeth—" He stopped. "Since. And I'm not good at the parts she needs that aren't the ranch. The talking, He made a gesture that encompassed everything he wasn't saying, which was considerable. "You're better at it than you think," Clara said. He looked skeptical. "You told her she was accurate today when she told May Hollis the sheriff was wrong." Clara set down the sewing. "A lot of men would have told her to be polite and not make trouble. You told her she was right." He was quiet for a moment. "She was right. Most men would still have told her to be polite." He looked at his hands on the table. "I keep thinking I'm doing it wrong. The whole thing. The ranch, Molly, He stopped himself from finishing that sentence, which she let pass. Elizabeth was the one who knew how to hold all of it together. How to make a household feel like one thing instead of a lot of separate things happening in the same building. He looked up. "You do that too. I don't know if you've noticed, but it's different since you came." She didn't know what to do with that, so she said, "It's still mostly separate things." "Less so," he said. She picked up the sewing again to have something to do with her hands, and he sat there a moment longer and then stood and said goodnight and went to bed. And she sat in the kitchen with the lamp and the mending and the sound of the ranch settling around her, and thought about what it meant to be told you held something together by a man who was not given to saying things he didn't mean. It meant something. She was careful not to decide yet what. On the third evening, Colton came. Not with deputies, not with a warrant. He came alone, which was its own kind of statement. A man confident enough in what he was doing that he didn't need the apparatus of authority around him. He came up the lane at dusk on a gray horse and tied it at the gate and walked to the porch and knocked like a man paying a social call. Thomas answered the door. Clara was in the kitchen and stayed there, but moved to where she could hear. "Mr. Reed," Colton said pleasantly, "I was hoping we could speak civilly." "We can speak," Thomas said. He did not open the door wider or invite him in. "I understand there's been some confusion about certain county documents and about Miss Wynn's situation." A brief pause, the kind designed to seem conciliatory. "My clients are not interested in making life difficult for you or your family. This is, at its heart, a property dispute, a civil matter. You had my wife's killer protected by a corrupt judge," Thomas said. Flat, no heat, just the fact of it stated plainly. "That's not a civil matter." A silence from the porch. "That's a very serious accusation," Colton said, and his voice had changed, the pleasantness wearing thinner. "One that would require substantial proof to—" "We have it," Thomas said. Another silence. "Mr. Reed," Colton's voice was quiet now, the register of a man deciding how honest to be. "Whatever you believe you have, I want to be clear that any action taken against my clients through the county courts will be defended vigorously with resources that—" "I'm not taking action through the county courts," Thomas said. "I'm taking it through the federal land office, through a territorial marshal who, as of yesterday morning, has a package of original documents and a signed statement from your own man in the county recorder's office." He paused. "I imagine that's why you're here, because you found out about Aldrich." The porch was very quiet for a moment. "Aldrich made a mistake," Colton said. "Aldrich made a decision," Thomas said. "There's a difference." Clara heard Colton's boot shift on the porch boards. "I want to be reasonable," he said, and the reasonableness had gone metallic underneath. "There are settlements that could be arranged, compensations. The eastern parcel is what my clients need. The main ranch, the house, none of that needs to be touched. A fair price for the—" "No," Thomas said. "Mr. Reed, the answer is no. Not for any price, not for any arrangement." Thomas said it the way he said things that were not negotiable, without anger, without drama, with the plain finality of a man who has come to the end of what he's willing to discuss. "My wife died for this land. I'm not selling it to the people who killed her." Colton was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, the pleasantness was entirely gone. "You should think carefully about what you're protecting," he said. "And who?" "I know exactly who I'm protecting," Thomas said. A pause. Then Colton's boots on the porch steps, and the sound of him walking back to his horse, and the horse moving up the lane in the dusk. Thomas came back into the kitchen. He stood at the counter and put both hands flat on it and looked at the wall for a moment, breathing. "You did well," Clara said. "I wanted to—" He stopped. "It doesn't matter what I wanted." "It does. You still didn't do it." He pushed off the counter. "He'll move fast now. He knows the clock." "Yes." Clara had been thinking about this, turning it over during the conversation she'd listened to from the kitchen. "He came here to assess, not to negotiate, to see how much we know and how solid we are." She looked at Thomas. "We need to get word to Prentice tonight. Colton will go to Allard next. If Allard issues any new orders before Thorne arrives, I'll ride to Prentice now. Take Bart. Don't go alone." He looked at her. "Please," she said. He took Bart. She locked both doors after they left and checked Molly was asleep, and then sat in the kitchen with the lamp turned low and Elizabeth Reed's journal open on the table in front of her. She'd taken it out of Thomas's room, where it had been sitting on the shelf, and read through it one more time, not looking for information she'd missed. Just being with it. Being with the woman who'd written it, who'd sat somewhere in this house or that barn and put these words down in her careful, urgent hand, knowing what she was approaching and approaching it anyway. "I'm going to the county recorder tomorrow. I have not told Thomas because he will try to stop me." She hadn't told him because she was protecting him, not from the knowledge Thomas Reed was not a man who needed protecting from difficult knowledge, but from having to watch her walk into danger and be unable to prevent it. She'd made a choice about what he could bear. Clara understood that. She'd made similar calculations in her own life about what to say and when, and about what protection looked like and whose job it was. She understood it, and she also thought, this is what it costs, that kind of protecting. Elizabeth had gone alone because she wanted to spare him, and she'd died alone, and he'd spent 2 years blaming himself for not being there. She closed the journal. Outside, she could hear the night sounds of the ranch, the horses in the barn, the cattle distant in the east pasture, the wind in the grass that went on forever. The sounds of a working place, a living place. She thought about what Thomas had said. It's different since you came. She thought about Molly at the kitchen table explaining to May Hollis that the sheriff was wrong, with the absolute confidence of a child who hasn't yet learned that being right isn't always enough. She thought about what she'd written in her first letter back to the Correspondence Bureau in February, sitting at the kitchen table in the Columbus boarding house with the lamp going low. She'd written, "I am a woman of limited resources and limited prospects, but not of limited character." She'd written it and then looked at it for a long time before deciding to leave it in. She left it in. Thomas came back at midnight with Prentice, who had the look of a man who'd been expecting a knock on his door and had been sitting up waiting for it. They went over the situation at the kitchen table, and Prentice confirmed what Clara had suspected. Allard could, theoretically, issue an injunction against any new federal inquiry on the grounds of jurisdictional overreach. It was a thin argument. It was also exactly the kind of argument a judge issues when he's trying to buy time for the people he's protecting. Can he make it stick? Thomas asked. Against a federal marshal? No. But he can slow things down, create procedural obstacles. If Thorne is still a day or two out, then we need Thorne here faster, Clara said. I can't make him ride faster, Prentice said. No. But we can make it harder for Allard to act. She leaned forward. If Allard issues an injunction, it has to be served. It has to go through Calhoun, and Calhoun is already compromised. Aldrich's statement implicates him directly. She looked at Prentice. Can you file a challenge to Calhoun's authority to serve any new orders? On the basis of his involvement. Prentice looked at her. With what court? With Allard's own court. First thing tomorrow morning. It won't succeed, but it creates a counterfiling that Allard has to acknowledge before he can proceed. And every hour of acknowledgement is an hour Thorne is riding closer. Prentice was quiet for a moment. That is actually a reasonable delaying tactic. It's a borrowed idea, Clara said. Borrowed from Elizabeth Reed's journal, from the language Elizabeth had used in her own challenge. She didn't say that. I'll file it at 7, Prentice said. When the court opens. He left. Thomas walked him out and came back, and they sat in the kitchen, and it was past midnight, and neither of them had anything left to strategize, and the silence was the kind that comes when you've done what you can do and what remains is out of your hands. Try to sleep, Claire said. I won't. Try anyway. He looked at her across the table. When this is over, he said, whatever over looks like, I would like to ask you something. She waited. He looked at the table, at his hands on it. Not now, when it's over, when it's the right time to ask it. He looked up. I just want you to know it's coming. So you're not surprised. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who kept the ranch ledger locked for 3 weeks and then left it open one morning without a word. Who told his daughter she was accurate when she should be polite. Who stood at the door of a room full of his dead wife's things and couldn't open it for 2 years, and then opened it because it was necessary, and because he was someone who did what was necessary even when it cost him. All right, she said, I'll be ready. He nodded and stood and went to bed. She sat alone at the table for a while longer, and then she put out the lamp and went to her room and lay down and thought about the morning and what it would bring, and somewhere between the thinking and the dark, she slept. She did not hear the riders coming until they were already at the gate. 3 of them, fast, and not slowing for the lane. She was up and at the window before she was fully awake, and what she saw in the early gray light was not Calhoun, not Colton, but 3 men she'd never seen before on horses that had been ridden hard from somewhere, and behind them, coming up the lane at a measured pace, a 4th man on a bay horse, dressed differently from the others. A coat that read federal without trying to. A hat that was not a sheriff's hat, but carried the same quality of authority. She was out of her room and down the stairs before Thomas appeared from his. Someone's coming, she said. He looked past her at the window. His face changed. The 4th man swung down from the bay horse in the yard and looked at the house, and then at the barn, and then at the landscape in the particular way of a man getting his bearings in a place he's been told about but never seen. Thomas opened the front door. The man looked at him. Thomas Reed? His voice was unhurried, carrying the flat authority of someone who doesn't need volume. I'm William Thorne, Federal Marshal, Territorial Land Office. He reached into his coat and produced credentials that Thomas looked at and then handed back. I received a package yesterday morning in Cheyenne that required me to ride through the night. He paused. I understand you have a significant amount of documentation and a considerable problem. We do, Thomas said. Thorne looked past him at Clara, who was standing in the hallway. And you're Miss Wynne. I am. He held her gaze for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite parse, assessing yes, but also something else, some quality of recognition that she didn't understand immediately. Aldrich told me about you, he said. He said you were the one who pushed him to come forward. He made his own choice, she said. He did, but he said you gave him the argument. Thorne looked between them. We have a great deal to do and not much time before Allard knows I'm in the county. Can we go inside? They went inside. Molly appeared at the top of the stairs in her nightgown, looking down at the scene in the front room with wide eyes. Thomas looked up at her. Go put your dress on, he said, and come have breakfast. Are those men marshals? She asked. Federal marshals, Thomas said. Molly looked at them with the expression of someone filing this away at high speed. All right, she said, and disappeared. Clara caught the ghost of something on Thorne's face, not quite a smile, but the almost of one, before he opened his case and got to work. What followed was 3 hours of the most concentrated and exhausting conversation Clara had ever sat through, and she'd been through a criminal trial. Thorne was thorough in the specific way of someone who knows that a case built quickly can be dismantled quickly, and he examined every document with the patience of a man who doesn't accept summaries when he can have originals. He asked Clara about Columbus, about the conviction, the charge, the name of the firm that had represented the accusing party, and he took notes in a small book with a precise economical hand. He asked Thomas about Elizabeth, about the challenge, about what Thomas had known at the time, about the months before she died. Thomas answered everything, and Clara watched him do it. Watched him hold himself together through an accounting of his own wife's murder that he was giving to a stranger at his kitchen table, with the particular kind of respect you feel for someone doing a hard thing because it is the necessary thing. Prentice arrived at 8 after his filing and added what he knew, and by mid-morning, the picture was complete enough that Thorne set down his pen and looked at all of them. All right, he said, here's what happens next. He sent 2 of his riders to Allard's chambers before the judge could issue anything new. He sent the 3rd to the county recorder's office to formally assume custody of the relevant files. He wrote 2 documents at the kitchen table, federal holds, he called them, that effectively froze all pending county court actions related to Harmon interests in the county pending federal review. Then he looked at Clara. The conviction in Columbus, he said. The territorial court doesn't have jurisdiction over that directly. But I can submit a finding that the conviction was obtained with the participation of a firm under federal investigation and request a review. He paused. It takes time, but it puts it in motion. How much time? She asked. Months, potentially. I won't pretend otherwise. He held her gaze. But it will be reviewed. And given what Aldrich has provided and what your own account corroborates, I believe the review will find what you know it will find. She nodded. Months was not what she wanted. Months was what existed. What about the ranch? Thomas asked. The eastern parcel transfer, fraudulent on its face, given the signature evidence, will be reversed. The other 2 parcels that Harmon acquired through similar means in this county will also be under review. He closed his notebook. Allard will be referred to the Territorial Judiciary Board for conduct review. Calhoun, he paused. Calhoun came to my men at the gate this morning before we came up the lane. He gave them a written statement. A silence around the table. He's been trying to get out from under this for years, Thorne said. Apparently he's been waiting for someone to make it possible. He said this without evident sympathy, but also without evident contempt. His statement corroborates Aldrich's. It adds detail about how the sheriff's ruling on Elizabeth Reed's death was... He stopped, looked at Thomas. Do you want the specifics of this now? Thomas's jaw was set. Yes, Thorne told him. The kitchen was very quiet for a long time afterward. Outside, Molly was in the yard with 2 of the federal riders, apparently conducting some kind of interrogation of her own about the specifics of federal authority, because her voice carried through the window at regular intervals, asking questions that the men answered with the bemused patience of people who had not expected this particular part of their morning. Thomas stood up from the table and went to the window and looked at her out there. This girl who had put flowers in a spare room for a stranger and told her father she was going to be a lawyer and held the whole thing together in her small, fierce way for 2 years. He stood there for a while without speaking. Clara stayed at the table. Thorne was packing his case. "Colton will be taken in for questioning this afternoon," he said, quietly enough that it was meant for her, not Thomas. "And the principal's at Harmon's Cheyenne office. This is going to take time to prosecute fully. I want to be honest about that." "I know how these things work," Clara said. "I know you do." He looked at her. That same quality of recognition she'd seen at the door. Aldrich said something else. He said you told him that the carrier matters as much as the truth. He paused. Elizabeth Reed was the carrier for 2 years, alone. Then it became you. He picked up his case. "I want you to know that counts for something, in my assessment and in the record." She looked at him. "It counts for something that Elizabeth Reed is dead," she said. "I'd rather she'd lived and counted for nothing." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said simply. "So would I." He went outside to his men. Thomas was still at the window. Clara came and stood beside him, not close, not touching, just beside him. Molly had apparently convinced one of the federal writers to let her look at his credentials and was examining them with the concentration of a judge reviewing a contract. "It's not finished," Thomas said. "No. Months, trials, whatever comes from the Harmon prosecution." "Yes. It's going to be a hard stretch." "It was already a hard stretch," Clara said. "At least now it's a hard stretch with the right people on the right side of it." He looked at her sideways. "Is that what we are? The right people?" "We're the people who stayed," she said. "That's usually how it works out." He turned back to the window. Outside, Molly had handed the credentials back and was now apparently delivering her opinion of the federal system to a man who outranked everyone in the county, and he was listening with an expression that suggested he might be taking notes. Despite everything, the exhaustion, the months ahead, the weight of what Thorne had told them about Elizabeth, Thomas Reed almost smiled. It wasn't a full one. It was the beginning of one, the first board of something that might eventually hold a person's weight. Clara saw it and said nothing and looked back out at the yard where the morning was fully established now and the sky had gone the clear, hard blue that comes after rain in Wyoming, and the ranch was going on around all of them the way ranches do, indifferent to the human drama being worked out inside it, because the cattle still needed tending and the fence still needed work and the kitchen garden was producing more squash than one family could eat. She thought, this is what staying looks like. Not the grand moment of arrival or resolution. This. The morning after, when the crisis has broken and what's left is just the ordinary business of continuing. She thought she could manage that. She thought, in fact, she was already doing it. The months that followed were not clean. That is the first thing worth saying about them. Because the tendency, when looking back at a thing that eventually resolved, is to compress the middle parts, to let the hard stretch between crisis and resolution flatten into a kind of summarized difficulty that doesn't require sitting inside it. But the months between Thorne's arrival and the day the territorial court issued its final rulings were genuinely hard in the way that sustained legal uncertainty is hard. Not dramatic mostly. Not the sharp crisis of arrest or confrontation, but the grinding daily weight of not knowing, of waiting for letters that sometimes came and sometimes didn't, of managing a ranch and a child and a complicated living arrangement, while somewhere in Cheyenne a process moved at the pace processes move when they involve powerful people who don't want to be implicated. Colton was taken in for questioning the afternoon of the day Thorne arrived, as promised. He was a careful man with careful lawyers, and he was not immediately charged. Harmon's principals in Cheyenne hired a firm from Denver that filed objections to the federal review on jurisdictional grounds, which delayed things by 6 weeks. Judge Allard resigned from the bench before the Judicial Conduct Board could convene, which was its own kind of answer. Guilty men, Clara had noticed, tended to shape their exit to avoid the formal declaration of what everyone already knew. Calhoun's cooperation proved more valuable than anyone had initially estimated. He had, it turned out, been keeping his own records, not out of conscience, but out of the self-protective instinct of a man who understood that people like Harmon made a practice of eventually requiring someone to take a fall, and he had decided years ago that fall would not be him if he had anything to say about it. His records detailed 4 years of coordinated land fraud across 3 Wyoming counties. 3 other ranching families, it emerged, had lost parcels through the same mechanism that had targeted the Reed Ranch. 2 of them had not had an Elizabeth Reed mapping the conspiracy from the inside, and had simply accepted the loss as the incomprehensible working of a system too large to fight. Those families were contacted by Thorne's office. Their cases were added to the federal complaint. This was the part Clara had not anticipated, that the work Elizabeth had done, contained in a leather journal hidden under a barn floorboard, would reach past the Reed Ranch into other lives, into other losses. She thought about that often in the hard months, about how a woman working alone at a kitchen table or in a barn loft with the light coming thin through the boards, building a case that no one had asked her to build, had, without knowing it, built a foundation large enough to hold more than she'd intended. There was something in that worth holding on to, even when the process was exhausting. The letter from the territorial court in Columbus arrived on a Tuesday in November, 7 months after Thorne had ridden up the lane in the early gray morning. Claire was in the kitchen garden, pulling the last of the season's squash before the first hard freeze came down from the mountains, when Molly appeared at the garden gate with an envelope held in both hands like it was something fragile. "It came," Molly said. "From Ohio." Clara stood up. She was wearing Thomas's old work gloves, which were too large for her hands and had been since she'd borrowed them in August and never returned them. She pulled them off and took the envelope and looked at the return address. Territorial Court of Ohio, Criminal Records Division. She had been waiting for this for 7 months. She had thought, during most of those 7 months, that she knew how she would feel when it arrived. She had been wrong about that. What she felt, standing in the garden with the frost-brown grass around her and the mountains already showing snow on the high ridges, was not relief exactly, and not vindication exactly, and not joy. It was something more like the feeling of a very old weight being set down, the recognition of how long you've been carrying something by the particular feeling in your arms when it's gone. She opened the envelope. The language was formal and dry, the language of institutions completing a procedural action. The conviction of Clara Marie Wynne, recorded October 1880, had been reviewed pursuant to a federal finding of interested party corruption in the originating case. The conviction was vacated. The record was expunged. Any documentation of the proceedings was to be considered void for all legal and civil purposes. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully along its original crease and put it in her apron pocket and looked at Molly, who was watching her with the focused attention she brought to things that mattered. "Good news?" Molly asked. "Yes," Clara said. "Are you going to cry?" "No." Molly considered this. May Hollis cries when she gets good news. She says it's because good news is surprising and surprising things make you cry. "I'm not surprised," Clara said. "I knew it was coming. I just had to wait for it." "Is that better? Knowing something good is coming and waiting for it?" Clara thought about this. "It's different," she said. "Surprises are easier to feel all at once. When you've been waiting a long time for something, it comes in slowly. You have to let it in a little at a time." She looked down at the squash in her basket. "Help me carry these in." Molly picked up the other side of the basket without being asked twice. She showed Thomas the letter that evening after supper after Molly was upstairs. She set it on the table in front of him, and he read it, and when he finished, he set it down and was quiet for a moment. "It's done," he said. "That part is done." He looked at her across the table. They had been living together in this house for 8 months now. 8 months of meals shared and work divided, and evenings at the kitchen table, and the gradual, unannounced process by which 2 people stop being strangers and become something else that doesn't have a simple name. The practical arrangement had become something else somewhere along the way, through the accumulation of small, ordinary things. The way he left coffee on the stove when he went out early because he'd noticed she needed it before anything else. The way she'd learned which fence line he was worrying about by the particular set of his shoulders at breakfast. Molly, who had decided some months ago that calling Clara by her first name was insufficient, and had begun calling her Clara my Clara, which Clara found embarrassing and which Thomas found, evidently, worth the private half-smile it produced in him each time. "I said I wanted to ask you something," Thomas said. "When it was over. When it was the right time." "I remember." He looked at the letter on the table, then at her. He was not a man who practiced speeches, and this showed. He started twice and stopped twice, and then looked at the ceiling briefly, and then back at her with the expression of someone who has decided to simply say the thing and not dress it. "I would like you to stay," he said. "Not as an arrangement, not as what we agreed to in the beginning." He paused. "As my wife. Actually, if you want that." Another pause. "I'm aware the original terms didn't include this, and you have every right to— It's— Thomas," she said. He stopped. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again, in case it hadn't landed. It had landed. She could see it in his face. The thing that had been held carefully for a long time, carefully letting go. "Molly's going to be insufferable about this," he said. "Molly has been expecting this for at least 4 months," Clara said. "She asked me in August whether I thought a wedding required a new dress, or if a good existing dress was sufficient. She said she was asking for a friend." Thomas closed his eyes briefly. "Of course she did. She has opinions about the flowers, too. I've heard them several times." "Of course she does." He opened his eyes and looked at Clara, and the almost smile had become a full one, which was still rare enough that she noticed it every time. "Are you sure? This is not—" He stopped. "I want to be clear that I know this is not what you came here for. I know you came here to survive. And you've done considerably more than that, and I don't want you to feel— Thomas." She kept her voice patient. "I came here with nothing to stay for and nothing to go back to. 8 months later, I have a kitchen garden and a child who's going to be a federal judge and a man who leaves coffee for me in the morning." She held his gaze. "I know what I want. I'm not confused about it." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The same gesture he'd made at the cell door months ago, brief and careful. But this time, he didn't let go. The wedding was small because both of them were people who found large gatherings effortful, and because the valley in December was cold and most of the county was not yet entirely comfortable with the events of the summer. Prentice officiated. He had, apparently, the authority to do so, though he seemed slightly surprised to be called upon to exercise it. May Hollis came, and Bart, and 2 families from further up the valley who had been cautious allies throughout the Harmon proceedings. Aldrich did not come, which was understandable given the complexity of his position, though he sent a note that was gracious in a way that suggested a man trying to square his accounts one gesture at a time. Molly wore a dress she had been planning since August, which was her existing best dress with new ribbon that she had purchased herself from the dry goods with money she'd saved from collecting eggs, an act of financial autonomy that Clara found remarkable and Thomas found alarming in the way parents find the early evidence of their children's independence alarming. She stood next to Clara during the ceremony with the focused solemnity of someone performing an important official function, which she essentially was. She had appointed herself to the role without being asked, and no one had argued the point. After, standing in the front room with the small gathering eating the cake Clara had made, imperfect as her baked things tended to be, the layers slightly uneven, but good. Prentice came and stood beside her with his coffee and said, quietly, "Elizabeth would have approved of this." "You didn't know me when Elizabeth was alive," Clara said. "No, but I knew her, and I know you now." He looked into his coffee. She was a woman who believed in building things, not just fighting for them. Building them. Herself, the ranch, this valley. He paused. "You have that quality. I've seen it in the garden and the girl and what you did for this case." He looked at her. "I'm glad you came." "I'm glad I stayed," Clara said. It was the more accurate thing. The final rulings from the Federal Land Office came in February, 14 months after Thorne had first ridden up the lane. Harmon and Associates was formally dissolved under federal order, their principals subject to prosecution for land fraud and conspiracy. Colton was charged, 12 counts ultimately, across 3 counties. The forged deeds were voided. The 3 parcels taken from the Reed Ranch, including the eastern land that Thomas's cattle had been grazing on anyway, because a fence line on a ledger doesn't mean much to cattle, were formally returned to the Reed deed. The 2 other families who had lost land through the same scheme received their parcels back, which in one case meant a family returning to land they'd left 3 years ago, a thing that took 3 weeks and a new roof on the house before it was livable again, but which they did, because a piece of ground you've worked is not easily replaced by any other piece of ground. Calhoun left the county before the new sheriff was appointed and was not, ultimately, prosecuted. His cooperation had been the price of that, and it was a price Thorne had judged worth paying. Clara had complicated feelings about this, which she kept mostly to herself because the alternative to Calhoun's deal was a weaker federal case and a harder road for the other families, and she understood the arithmetic even when the arithmetic felt wrong. Judge Allard died in March in Cheyenne, before his case came fully before the judicial board. She had complicated feelings about that too. She did not pretend otherwise. Aldrich stayed. He continued as county recorder. There had been discussion about whether this was appropriate, given his prior involvement, but the new territorial appointee to the county had taken the position that a man who had come forward and whose testimony had dismantled a 4-year conspiracy was not precisely the same as the men who had built it, and that the county recorder's office needed someone who actually knew what was in the files. He was, by all accounts, extremely thorough afterward. Over-thorough, possibly. Clara heard from the dry goods woman that he checked every signature on every document that crossed his desk with a magnifying lens, which was perhaps excessive, but was also understandable. The school came later, and it came the way things come when a community is ready for them, sideways, through a series of conversations that didn't look like planning until they were. It started with Molly, as things in that family tended to do. She had been receiving her lessons at the kitchen table from Clara since the previous winter, and she had progressed to the point where Clara was having to research ahead of her to stay useful, which was both a source of pride and a practical problem. The nearest school was 14 miles east, which was too far for a child in winter, and the valley had 3 other families with children in similar situations, close enough to know it was a problem, far enough from the nearest institution that no one had solved it. Clara mentioned this to Thomas in April of the 2nd year. He was quiet about it for a week, which was how he processed things that required more than a single decision. Then he said, at breakfast one morning, "The old bunkhouse is sound, it just needs windows." She looked at him. "If you wanted a building," he said, "it's there. That would require a teacher." "You're already teaching." "I'm teaching one child. Teaching 12 or 15 is different." "Is it?" She thought about this. "I'd need books. Proper ones. Prentice probably knows where to get books." "You've thought about this," she said. "I had a week," he said, and went back to his eggs. It took 8 months to make it real. There were letters to write to the Territorial Education Office, which had a grant program for valley schools that was theoretically available and practically difficult to access, requiring documentation that Clara produced with the same thoroughness that Elizabeth had brought to the land challenge, because she had learned from Elizabeth's example that a case made carefully is harder to dismiss than one made quickly. There was the bunkhouse to repair, which Thomas did over the summer with Bart and 2 of the men from neighboring ranches who had been pulled into the orbit of the Reed Ranch in the months since the Harmon case. Not quite employees, not quite tenants, but the kind of loose affiliates that a working ranch accumulates when it becomes known as a place that treats people fairly. There were families to convince, some of whom were suspicious of formalized anything after years of watching county institutions serve interests other than their own, and convincing them required the particular kind of patience that is not argument but presence, showing up, being consistent, making clear through repetition that this was not a temporary enthusiasm. It opened in the spring of the 2nd year. 11 children, 3 days a week, in a bunkhouse with new windows and a wood stove, and a row of books along the east wall that Prentice had sourced from a school closing in Laramie and transported at some personal inconvenience in 2 wagon loads. Clara stood in the doorway on the first morning and looked at it, at the children settling onto the benches Thomas had built, at Molly in the front row, with the proprietary satisfaction of someone whose idea this fundamentally was, even if she'd never said so directly, at the books on the wall and the light coming in through the windows and the wood stove ticking as it warmed. And she felt something she didn't have a simple word for. Not pride exactly, because pride implies you've done more than you have. Closer to rightness, the feeling of a thing being in its correct place. She went in and closed the door and began. Looking back, and she would look back years later, in the way you look back at the part of your life when the ground shifted under you and you didn't fall, What stayed with her was not the resolution, not the federal rulings or the voided conviction, or even the moment on the porch when Thorne rode up. What stayed was the accumulation of small things that had added up to a life she'd chosen rather than one she'd survived. The morning she'd arrived in Red Hollow with her canvas bag and her rehearsed sentences about what she could offer. Molly's bare feet on the platform at the station, and the hand that took hers without being asked. The burned biscuits and the opened ledger and the journal in the barn loft and the footsteps in the hallway, and all the careful, frightened, necessary choices she'd made in the dark between one thing and the next. She had arrived as a mail-order bride, a woman purchased by letter, delivered by train, assessed for her usefulness. That was the transaction, plain and undecorated. And there is a certain kind of person who looks at a transaction like that and sees only what it is and stays only as long as the terms hold and leaves when something better becomes available. Clara was not that kind of person. She was the kind of person who looked at a transaction and saw what it could become if she stayed and worked and didn't flinch when the staying got difficult. She thought sometimes about what her life would have been if she'd done what Colton offered, signed the statement, taken the passage, left Wyoming. She would have been free, technically. The conviction dropped, the road open, and she would have left Thomas with a ranch he was about to lose, and Molly without what Molly had needed, and Elizabeth's work buried in a barn loft to rot. She would have carried that with her, not as guilt exactly, but as the knowledge of what she'd walked past. And that kind of knowledge makes a person smaller over time. It narrows the space you're willing to occupy, because you've learned that you'll leave when it gets hard, and so you never quite let yourself fully arrive anywhere. She had not left. She was not always sure it was courage that kept her. Sometimes it was stubbornness, and sometimes it was the simple fact that she had nowhere else to go. And sometimes it was Molly's face across the kitchen table asking her if she was going to stay. Different reasons, on different days. She'd found that was how it worked in practice. You don't stay for one clean reason. You stay because of the accumulation of small reasons, the way snow accumulates, each flake inconsequential, and all of them together capable of holding weight. Thomas was not an easy man to be married to. She would say that plainly because the truth of it was part of what made the life real. He was given to long silences that she'd had to learn to read, which were which, the ones that needed her and the ones that needed leaving alone. He worked himself past reasonable limits and had to be argued with to stop, and he was not always receptive to the argument. He carried Elizabeth in a way that hadn't disappeared, would never fully disappear. And there were moments in the early years when Clara felt the presence of that, not as jealousy exactly, because you can't be jealous of someone whose legacy is the reason you have anything, but as a kind of careful navigation, a recognition that love built in the space a previous love has left is built on complicated ground. But he also left coffee on the stove in the mornings. He showed up. He said things he meant and didn't say things he didn't. And when she put something in front of him that was hard, he didn't look for the door. He was, in his foundational character, a man who stayed. Not from inability to leave, but from the deep conviction that the thing you've built is worth the staying. She understood that. She had come to share it. Molly grew up sharp and principled and relentless in the specific way of a person who was told, early, that she was accurate when she should have been told to be polite. She did not become a lawyer, exactly. The Valley didn't produce that kind of path easily in those years. But she became the kind of woman who read every document she signed and expected others to do the same, and who could spot a forged signature at 30 paces, which was a skill she attributed directly to her mother and indirectly to everything that had happened in the summer she was 7 3/4. She taught at the school for a season, before she married and moved to the next valley over. She came back often. She always had opinions about the curriculum. The school ran for 11 years before the county established a formal district school closer to town. By then, 34 children had learned to read in the old bunkhouse on the Reed Ranch, and some of them had gone further than that, and a few of them had come back to this valley instead of leaving it, which is the most a school in a place like that can reasonably hope for. Clara taught for all 11 of those years, which was not what she'd come to Wyoming for, and not what she'd expected when she'd stood in the doorway on the first morning and counted 11 children on the benches. But she'd found somewhere in the first year that teaching was the work that suited her most deeply, not because she was naturally patient, because she wasn't always, but because it required the exact qualities she'd spent her whole life developing out of necessity. The ability to read a person and understand what they actually needed rather than what they said they needed. The willingness to say a hard thing plainly and then stay present for the reaction. The conviction that a person's capacity is not the same as their current situation. She had learned those things in hard ways, in Ohio courtrooms and Columbus boarding houses and a cell in Red Hollow. She put them to better use in a bunkhouse, with new windows and a row of books along the east wall. The Reed Ranch went on. Cattle and drought and fence lines and the ordinary grinding beauty of working land that doesn't care how you feel about it and produces anyway. Thomas lived to see the county's character change, slowly, unevenly, in the way that institutional change happens when enough of the bad actors are gone and the people who replace them are at least trying, if not always succeeding. He was 71 when he died, of the kind of accumulated wear that comes from a lifetime of physical labor that a body eventually presents its bill for. He died in the room where Elizabeth's things had once been preserved, in a bed that was no longer only his, and Clara was there, which was what mattered. She was 68 when she wrote down, at Molly's insistence, the account of the summer that had changed everything. Not for publication, she had no interest in publication, but because Molly said the grandchildren should know it, and Clara had spent enough of her life watching important things get buried in barn lofts to argue the point. She wrote it plainly, in the American way, without ornament. She wrote about the train platform and the canvas bag and the burned biscuits and the journal and the cell and the marshal riding up in the early gray morning. She wrote about Elizabeth because Elizabeth deserved to be written about by someone who understood what she'd done and what it had cost. She wrote about the kind of belonging that isn't granted but built, through daily action, through staying, through the particular decision, repeated over years, to be present rather than protected. She did not write about it as something exceptional. She wrote about it as something true, because the exceptional things, the fraud, the murder, the federal case, those were not what the story was about. In the end, they were what happened. The story was about what you choose to do with what happens, and whether you are the kind of person who stays or the kind who leaves, and how that choice, made once or made daily, becomes who you are. She had been afraid she was the kind who leaves. She had evidence suggesting it in those early years in Columbus. Every time she'd moved to a new room in a new boarding house, every time she'd taken a new job because the previous one had become untenable, every time she'd rebuilt her life in smaller terms because someone had reduced it, she had been afraid that she was not capable of staying anywhere for long enough to matter. She had been wrong about that. Or rather, she had become someone capable of staying. It had not been her natural state. It had been the thing the Reed Ranch and Molly and Thomas and Elizabeth's work and all the necessary terrible things that Summer had asked of her, and she had given. She had grown into it. That, she thought, sitting at the kitchen table in November with the mountains showing snow on the ridges and the school closed for the winter and the sound of the ranch going on around her the way it always had, was the thing worth writing down. Not that a woman arrived at a frontier station with nothing and built a life. That happened. That had always happened. Women had been building lives out of nothing since before there was a word for frontier. What was worth writing down was this, that the building is not the dramatic moment. It is not the arrival or the crisis or the resolution. It is the morning after, when the crisis has passed and the work is still there, and you pick up the tools and continue. It is the coffee left on the stove, the seed put in the ground in faith. The child's question answered honestly, even when honest is harder than kind. It is the daily choosing, to stay, to build, to remain present to the life you're living, rather than the one you imagined or the one that was taken from you. Clara Wynne had come to Red Hollow on a train with a worn canvas bag and a letter and a past she hadn't told anyone about, looking for somewhere to survive. She had stayed and built and taught and loved and been loved imperfectly back. And she had outlasted the men who tried to erase her. And she had put 34 children's names in a register along the east wall, and she had watched a girl with bare feet and undone braids grow into a woman who read every document she signed. She had done all of this in a valley she hadn't chosen, in a life she hadn't planned. She would not have traded it.